When people ask me, who are you, and where are you from? So I'm just a barefoot boy from Harlem. Well, my fear was that there would be a line outside the personnel office at the Washington Post for this job. So I ran out of the building and grabbed a taxi and asked the cab driver, do you know where the Washington Post is? He said, yes. And I said, get there as fast as you can. And I moved into the community. I was living there in a roach-infested basement apartment. I killed all the roaches in the apartment eventually. But that was the nature of the community that I was living in. Well, I imagine they would feel shame if they were middle class. That would be a middle class value, shame. And middle class always tends to think that their values are universal.
Right.
The middle class values are not universal among the poor. They live by a different standard. They're not even included in the aspirations of being middle class. So no, they didn't feel shame. And then the two soldiers were standing there debating in Swahili whether or not to shoot us. And I was saying to myself, oh boy, you really bought the farm this time. You pushed the envelope too far.
Welcome to the UIUC Talkshow. Our goal with this show is to introduce you to the most interesting people with the most interesting ideas. Today we're having a conversation with Professor Leon Dash. Welcome.
Oh, thank you. Glad to be here.
We want to start with so on your Twitter profile, you describe yourself as a barefoot boy from Harlem.
Yes.
Tell us more about that.
Well, it's just keeping my humility. And I grew up in Harlem. I wasn't barefoot, so it's just a joke. Yeah. And I often introduce myself in that way. When people ask me, who are you and where are you from? So I'm just a barefoot boy from Harlem. To let them know that I don't think of myself in an overinflated way. It's my attempt at being humble.
Why is that important for you?
It keeps me equal. It keeps my equilibrium, right? Because you can lose sight of where you fit in the universe. That you're just a small peg in the largest universe. So that's how I like to think of myself.
And you indeed had an interesting childhood. That I was reading a story how you were in college and you were looking for a night job, and you went to a couple, congressmen and you ended up going to Robert Kennedy's office.
Right, when he was a New York senator.
Correct. And you went there, and then someone told you, they couldn't offer you a job or something, but they told you to go to the Post.
Well, they told me they saw in the Washington Post that morning an ad for a night copyboy at the Washington Post on the lobster shift. And I had to ask, what is the lobster shift? I don't know what you're talking about. And the woman who was helping me said, well, that's the last shift of a 24-hour cycle. And so I said, okay. And she told me what salary they were offering, and it was a night job, 6:30 in the evening to 2:30 in the morning. Well, my fear was that there would be a line outside the personnel office at the Washington Post for this job. So I ran out of the building and grabbed a taxi and asked the cab driver, do you know where the Washington Post is? He said, yes. And I said, get there as fast as you can. This is early afternoon. And in those days, you didn't need there was no security. You could just walk into the building and go upstairs to, I think it was on the third floor, the personnel office. And I walked into the personnel office and there was no line for this job, for which I was grateful. So they gave me an aptitude test and gave me a short interview and then sent me up to the 5th floor to be interviewed by Stephen Isaacs, who was the city editor, and Tom Drain, who was the supervisor of copyboys. And copyboys just run errands, do all sorts of errands within the newspaper building. And after the interview with Stephen Isaacs and Tom Drain, I was hired. And I started on November 5th, 1965. It was a great job for me because it was indoors. It wasn't a lot of stress. I would sit at the desk that I had there most of the time, and study. And then there was a room full of typewriters so I could write my papers. So it was a great job for me. Before that, I had gotten a job steam cleaning buildings at night. And the weather started getting chilly. And I said, oh, no, this is not going to work through the winter. So that's when I really started looking for an indoor job.
But even to show up at Robert Kennedy's office, even then and even today, that takes courage. That takes initiative. So who told you about that, or how do you come up with that idea?
I had just come down to Washington from New York State, or from New York City. Jacob Javits was the Republican senator, and Robert Kennedy was the Democratic senator. I went to both of their offices. They were my representatives, so I felt entitled. And I went to Jacob Javits' office, and that was a dead end. Then I went to Robert Kennedy's office. And the woman gave me a hint at a possibility, and I took it, and within a day or two, I was employed.
And I think it's funny because you ended up winning the Robert Kennedy Journalism and Book Award, which, in a way, everything came around.
Years later, yeah.
Of course.
Mm-hmm.
I found that interesting. How, everything, when you went from, finding that initial job that led you there, and then you ended up winning this award later on.
Mm-hmm. I don't have much to say about it.
Yeah, no worries.
Right. This humility that you mentioned before, was there an incident that made you want to establish that equilibrium, or?
That's come over time. You could say in my youth, like many young men, I was arrogant and thought a lot of myself. And over time, particularly by the time I entered my 30s, I began changing my attitude about that and looking at myself as just a small part of the universe is the best way to put it, and there was nothing extraordinary about me, and there was no need for me to be so arrogant, and I was pretty arrogant, and I didn't like that about myself. And I began to change. Well, people had been telling me for some years that I was awfully arrogant, and I would ignore them. But over time, I began looking at myself and wanted to bring myself down to earth and recognize that my feet were made out of clay, yeah, in a biblical sense, yeah.
Did your time at the Peace Corps play a role in this?
It might have made a contribution to it because I was a rural high school teacher in Western Kenya, and really enjoyed that. One of the things that, I was married then, one of the things that my wife and I discovered was we started making friends we lived among the Nandi. They don't live in villages, they live in homesteads because they all keep cattle. Cattle is very important, they're pastoralists. And we started inviting people to our house for Sunday, midday meal. And they'd show up all hours of the day and night after we invited them. So we were highly annoyed by that, particularly my wife, because we both she grew up in Haddonfield, New Jersey, I grew up in New York City. And we both used to schedules and time. Time is a very important element of your life in an urban setting. It wasn't as important in the rural setting that we lived in. And then people began to reciprocate and invite us to different functions at their homes. And you'd leave early in the morning to walk to where they lived, to their home, if they were having some sort of celebration. And usually we were the guest of honor. And the main entree, or the main course that day, was still alive. It was great effort to show us that the goat that we were going to be eating, or the chickens we were going to eat, were still alive, and they would show them to us. And we began to realize that we were operating on a Western model of time, and here, in this, the people we were interacting with are called the Nandi. And here among the Nandi, time is not so important as honoring the guests that you invited to your home. So we took a different attitude. If we invited somebody to the house, they said, we'll be ready for whenever you get there, day or night. Don't come Monday, because I have classes Monday. But yeah. So we began to relax, and one of the things I think we both made a transition to recognize that people were not going to conform to our way of living. We had to conform to theirs.
Because you were the outsider.
We were the outsiders, yeah. Right. Teachers have high status in Kenya. They did in that. This is 69 and 70.
Right.
So we were of high status, but we still had to adapt to the lifestyle around us. And we didn't socialize with our students. The language of instruction was in English. But we socialized with most of the adults in the community we lived in outside of school. Yeah. So we had to adapt to their way of living. Yes.
When you were there, did you consider transitioning to that lifestyle, like for the rest of your life?
Being a pastoralist? No, I didn't. I loved the area that I lived in. It was in the western escarpment of the Rift Valley, about 8,000 feet above sea level. And so it never got above 80. It never went below 50, maybe 45. 45 would have been very, very cold. So I liked the climate, and I liked the lifestyle as a teacher, and I liked the people that I interacted with. But also I wanted to get back to journalism because I had started in journalism before I took a 2-year leave of absence from the Washington Post to go into the Peace Corps. That was my effort of trying to duck the war in Vietnam. But being in the Peace Corps was no guarantee that you would not be drafted into the Army. And I was draftable. I was 24, and because Congress hadn't declared war. If Congress declares war, then you're draftable up to the age of 35. If Congress doesn't declare war, you're draftable up to the age of 26. At least that was the law in 1968. So my draft board, in fact, when I was in language training in upstate New York, Roscoe, New York, doing 6 weeks of immersion in Swahili, my wife and I. My father called me and said the draft board was looking for me. They thought I was still in Washington. They said, where is he? We can't find him in Washington, and where is he now? And my father said, well, he's in upstate New York doing language training. Language training? What are you talking about? So they wanted me to come down from Roscoe and meet with the draft board, and I did, my wife and I. And they said, they asked me a lot of questions, and why are you going into Peace Corps? Because I want to make a contribution, I want to help, and so on and so on. And they said, well, you're not in the Peace Corps now, you're in Peace Corps training. So I'll tell you what, this is what the chairman of the draft board said to me. You call us on the first Monday of 1969 and let us know what your status is. And he directed me to the clerk of the draft board. So I wrote down her number and her name. Now, he didn't recognize, but I recognized right away that there's no sense in me calling the draft board on the first Monday in 1968, because that was New Year's Day. The draft board was closed. There was no one there to answer the phones. But we were scheduled to leave out of John F. Kennedy Airport on a chartered KLM flight to Kenya that evening on New Year's Day, January 68. My wife and I got on the plane and flew away. Flew to Kenya. Then they wanted to showcase us in Nairobi, but we didn't want that. And so they sent us up to the village to a Harambee. Harambee means let's pull together, to a community-built high school. It was primitive, yeah. But about 2 or 3 months later, I got a letter from our draft board in Kiloboni, Kenya. And I said, how did they find me in Kiloboni, Kenya? And they said, well, they contacted the Peace Corps. I mean, I figured they contacted the Peace Corps and they gave them my address. So I refused to open the letter. After a couple of days, my wife said, you better open that letter before they send somebody up here, some Marine from the embassy to come and drag you out of here. So I opened the letter, and the letter said they gave me a 2-year deferment, which meant I would be 26 and not draftable after that end of those 2 years. So that was it. That was it. But the draft boards were drafting people that I came to Kenya with. I think there were 124 of us.
Oh, wow.
And people who came from small towns and rural districts in the United States who were men were being drafted out of the Peace Corps and sent for a physical at a U.S. Air Force base in Italy. And if they passed the physical, they went straight to Germany for basic training. And after 8 weeks of basic training, then they got 2 weeks leave of home and then went to Vietnam.
Do they mention why, like how they choose someone over the other?
Well, it was a quota. By this time, when I was 15, we moved out of Harlem to the North Bronx. So when I turned 18, when you registered with the draft board, I was living in the North Bronx. And there were a lot of people to choose from. A lot of high school dropouts to choose from. Not so much college kids. While I was in college, I had a 2-year deferment. After I graduated, the deferment was over. So they just decided to let me go because they could fill their quota with people who were not going on to college or had dropped out of high school or were high school graduates. You could still get a deferment if you were married with 2 children, but if you hadn't done that, then you were vulnerable to being drafted. And really, a lot of people who were low income or working poor were the majority of people who were drafted to fight in Vietnam.
I cannot imagine living in that kind of state where you need to choose between whether you can do what you love doing versus you like give it up for a bigger cause.
Well, I was not in favor of the war in Vietnam at all. I just thought it was part of American anti-communism and sort of a knee-jerk reaction to what was happening in Vietnam. So first the Vietnamese tried to put out the French, and then they had to put out the Americans. So no, I was not in favor of the war in Vietnam at all, from a political standpoint.
Right. Was that one of the first times you really thought about perhaps your mortality in a way? Because, going to Vietnam, has different consequences. So
well, I figured I would end up in a Stars and Stripes unit as a working journalist. So I wasn't necessarily concerned that I would be put into a front line or jungle situation of attacking Viet Cong or regular Vietnamese army people in the forest of Vietnam. I thought I'd be covering that and probably covering it from a distance. I already knew one person who I'd worked with at the post went into, I don't remember if he was drafted or he went into the army voluntarily, but he ended up in one of those units, and he had told me, we had written to each other back and forth, and told me what it was like. It was our basic training at the Washington Post. It was very easy to get into one of those units and write for the Stars and Stripes, which was the Army's publication. So I figured if push came to shove and I was drafted, I wasn't going to refuse to go into the Army. But I would go in and I would seek to get into one of those units. So mortality really I wasn't afraid of going into a combat situation or into Vietnam. That didn't bother me so much as contributing to a war that I thought was unjust. And there was a lot of information available in the 60s about Vietnam, both pro-Vietnam and anti-war.
Especially in a lot of college campuses,
Oh, yes.
People were not quite pro-Vietnam.
The head of the draft board came to speak at Howard University when I was a student there, and the students ran him off the stage. They didn't want to hear it. Lieutenant General Hershey is his last name. I think it was John B. Hershey. I was a reporter there writing the story because I knew what was going to happen ahead of time. The students told me. Right. So the Post had the only photographer, and I was the only reporter there. It was great for me. It was a front page story.
Right.
Yeah.
Is that how you develop your ability to find those good stories? Or I guess a better question might be, how do you know when there's a good story in something?
A new sense.
Right.
When you know I didn't know that because that happened after the 6:30 evening deadline. I didn't know that I would make the major printing edition, which begins at 10:30, but I did make it. And it's the home delivery edition. It begins at 10:30 and it runs until 2 in the morning. off the printing presses. I knew it was a good story. I didn't know it was going to be a front page story, and it was a front page story. Other stories that I've done, I knew this right at the beginning that they would be front page stories or front page series. Okay. I began writing series in 1973. And I wrote a series, or a couple of series, just about every year after that. And I always knew that my series would be a front page series. 7 days, 8 days. Sunday to Sunday was 7 days. Usually you got Sunday to Friday. A couple of times I got Sunday to Sunday, which was 8 days, which makes you feel good. But so you know that the quality my editors knew that what I would be turning in would be a front page series. So we had discussed it long before I was even writing, when I was doing the research and the reporting. Yeah.
And this series was what later became the book. Is that accurate?
Which series now?
The series that you were mentioning.
Well, there were 2 books that came out of the series.
Right.
Well, one book was When Children. No, 3 books.
Okay.
One is Shame of the Prisons that I did with Ben Bakdikian,
Right.
former dean of journalism he wasn't dean at the time, he was an editor at the Post, but he's dead now, late dean of journalism, University of California, Berkeley School of Journalism. We did a series together. And I've forgotten, that would be my first series that I was part of. I only did one part of it, but that was the first series that I was part of. And I think that ran in 71. I'm sure it ran in late 1971. Then that was put into a book, Simon and Schuster. Then I did a series was published in January '86. And that was when the series title was Teenage Pregnancy at Risk. Oh, no, it was At Risk Teenage Pregnancy, something like that. And that book came out a couple of years later, as the title was When Children Want Children. And I specifically chose that title because there was so much misinformation. People were thinking that adolescents were getting pregnant accidentally, out of ignorance. And they were very clear with me that no, they wanted to have children. In fact, they hid the pregnancy from their parents and other relatives so that the parent and other relatives wouldn't insist on an abortion because they wanted to have a child. And then I followed an underclass family for 4 years, headed by a woman named Rosa Cunningham. And over the 4 years, interviewed her multiple times, all 8 of her adult children, 5 of her 30-odd grandchildren, and 6 of her 11 brothers and sisters. And that was full time. That was my last big series. It wasn't my last series, but it was the last one. The last series ran after I came here, called I think the title was Young Male Killers, where I spent time interviewing 2 brothers who were both in federal prison for murder and had committed their murders as adolescents. And I was trying to dig up what was the transition from children to killers. And that sort of laid it out, yeah. That ran in November of '99. And I got comments from, colleagues. I thought you were teaching at University of Illinois. I said, well, the series was, when I left, the series was ready to go, and they finally got it in. I'm glad they got it in. Yeah.
I want to ask you 3 follow-up questions, so we'll go part by part. The first question is that if even during early college you were a reporter and when you transferred to
I was working full time, and people don't understand that. I was working full time at night as a reporter and going to school during the day full time. Yeah, right.
But why writing? You could have done many things in your life. Like why? Like, what did you find in writing? What attracted you to writing and journalism?
Well, it was like writing found me. Remember, I was looking for an indoor job. I was steam cleaning buildings
Right.
at night. That was the first job I got for a company called Porter Clean.
Correct.
And that was great because it was at night and they paid a lot if you got up on the scaffold and got up on the side of the building with the steam hose and cleaned the building off. I forget how much they paid, but they paid a lot for wages at that time. And the only reason I started looking for an indoor job was because the weather started to turn. And I could see myself covered with icicles out here in the winter, steam cleaning buildings. I said, no, this is not going to work. And so we described how I got the job at the Washington Post. So I was looking for a job, any job that would sustain me while I was going to school. So I was paying tuition, my own room and board, buying my own books, all of that. And the job as a copyboy did that very easily. So I started working at the Post in November 1965, and then the city editor, who I told you about, Stephen Isaacs, approached me in the newsroom one day, and it was April 1966. So what is that, November, December, January,
5 months.
4 months, 6 months. And asked me, did I want to go into the 2-year intern program, reporter intern. So I didn't ask to go into the intern program. I wasn't seeking to go into the intern program. In fact, he laughed at my reaction. So I looked at him and said, well, how much does it pay? And he said, how much does it pay? You know, we got a line outside the Washington Post, people trying to get in here and get a position like this, and you're asking me how much does it pay? I said, well, I have bills to pay, and food to eat, and a car note to pay. And he laughed, and he said, it pays more than you're earning now. I said, okay, I'll do it. So that was the process. So when I started reporting and writing, it just became interesting to me, more interesting. What I had really planned to do was to finish my undergraduate degree and go to law school, graduate from law school, and make a lot of money, right? I didn't do any of that. But I got addicted to journalism while I was doing my undergraduate degree. And when they gave me the 2-year leave of absence to come back, I left in fall of '68 to go into the Peace Corps training. I came back in February of 1971. That's what I wanted to do. I wanted to be a reporter. I became a staff reporter. Let's see. I went into the summer internship program in June of 1966. And by December 1967, I was a staff writer. Now, I wasn't supposed to make staff writer until June of '68, but I was a year and a half in and I was made a staff writer. So I was committed and interested. So really, journalism found me. I don't think I was looking for a job in journalism initially, yeah.
You know, that makes me wonder, what if the person at Robert Kennedy's office would have sent you into a engineering office or a finance. Like, do you think you would have been doing finance or?
Anything moving. My attitude then was I didn't have any direction. Only thing I was thinking of was going to law school. That I would needed the law degree. If I really wanted to make money and live well, then for me, I figured a law degree would help me. And I was very interested in constitutional law because I was very interested in the civil rights movement. I'd already participated in the March on Washington in 1963, which was a huge march, December 28th, 1963. I was 19. And I was I was keeping up with the news and I was watching what was happening in terms of civil rights demonstrations. And I participated in some in New York City with the group called Congress of Racial Equality, CORE. And so I said, constitutional law seems to be a good, and I was aware of Thurgood Marshall. He had won the anti-segregation in school and education decision in 1954 when I was 10. I wasn't very aware of that in 1954 when I was 10, but I became aware of it when I became an older teenager. I think I became aware of that decision really, Brown versus the Board of Education, when I was in high school. So, the only thing I was focused on, I was going to get good grades as an undergraduate and go to law school. I knew I had to have a B+ average. to get into any decent law school. And I figured I might as well go to Howard's law school. You know, I'd be familiar with the campus. And so that was my intent, right? And running off to the Washington Post only came about because that woman alerted me that there was a job open. When she said 6:30 in the evening to 2:30 in the morning, that's what really turned me on, because that was perfect. It was after classes. I was still young enough to go without 8 hours sleep a night. And so I just rushed out of there, and I spent what little money I had on a cab ride over to, I didn't have a lot of money. I hailed a cab and went to the Washington Post. And I would have been seriously deflated if I hadn't gotten that job. But I thought there would be a line. I told you, I thought there'd be a line, and there wasn't a line. I think I was the only person that applied.
I find that so interesting because it just seemed like the world arranged to give you this perfect thing that you would, you know, eventually, in your words, that you became addicted to.
To journalism.
Through journalism. Yeah. And it just seemed like that was a perfect thing for you because, you know, once you look at everything you've done and how much you enjoyed it, it just seemed like it was meant to.
Well, and it was happenstance.
Right.
Or you can say one of the higher powers of the universe, or the higher power of the university, was guiding me. I didn't feel any guidance. It was just, to me, it was serendipitous. Yeah.
You know, a lot of young people, our age, students, they feel really worried about who they are, where they're going. And when I hear your story, you were just trying to make it through, to graduate, to go to law school. You were not thinking about, you know, winning prizes or writing books or even becoming a famous editor or being a professor. That was not even on your mind.
No.
What can you tell students that are worried, stressed about their life, and they really want to know how everything aligns together?
How everything will work out in the future.
Well, it's not guaranteed.
Exactly.
I understand that. And it wasn't guaranteed for me. I consider myself fortunate, and I remind myself that's part of my humility. I consider myself very fortunate to make all the ins and outs that I did, and do this because on 2 separate occasions, I lived with guerrillas in Angola, and that was fun. I saw it as fun, but both times I was in the middle of a war zone, you know. So I consider myself quite fortunate. In Uganda, when I was an African correspondent, I was an African correspondent from 79 to 84. And in the 80s, I was in Kampala, Uganda, and looking at a section of Kampala that had been decimated by the government. And the government didn't want anybody going in there. But I went in there, I convinced the cab driver to take me in there. And 2 soldiers came up. This is 1982. Soldiers came up and leveled their rifles at myself and the cab driver and made us get out of the cab, and took all our money, took my sunglasses, took my radio. And then the 2 soldiers were standing there debating in Swahili whether or not to shoot us. And I was saying to myself, oh boy, you really bought the farm this time. You pushed the envelope too far. And the cab driver, who was also fluent in Swahili, the 2 soldiers didn't know that I knew Swahili quite well. When I left Kenya, I was fluent in Swahili. I had a State Department oral exam, and I got a 4 out of 5. And so, but that was 69 and 70, and now we're here in 82, and I'm listening to them debate my fate, and I can't react physically or any other way, because I don't want them to know that I know Swahili, because they would figure that I was too sophisticated to let go. What they were afraid of is that we would report this theft or robbery to their camp commander, and then the camp commander would have a lineup, and the cab driver and I would pick them out of the lineup, and they would be executed on the spot. So the cab driver very effectively was saying, no, this is just a dumb American journalist. He doesn't know anything, and you know, you need to let us go. You've got all our money, and you know, I've got enough gas to get us back into town, and so on and so on. And he convinced them to let us go. And that was it. And then one of the soldiers said to me in English, don't you come back into this area. I said, you don't have to worry about it. Yeah. So it was a good element, both the robbery and seeing the area of Kampala, the capital that was decimated because of political conflicts in Uganda, was important elements of my story. But I felt fortunate to get out alive because they really were serious about not being picked out of a lineup and executed. Yeah. And I never pursued it. You know, I could replace everything that was stolen from me. I could replace very easily. Yeah.
Do you think there's something to those, near-death experiences that gave a more, perspective to life? Because once you experience something like that, a deadline for a story or a deadline for a homework, they just don't have the same meaning.
Right.
Do you think that added?
They don't produce the same level of anxiety.
Right.
Meeting the deadline. You know, life goes on, and you begin to recognize that. And being perfect no longer is that important. You can be imperfect and live with your imperfections. I have plenty of imperfections. I just live with them. They upset you, I'm sorry. I just live with them myself. Yeah. So you take a more relaxed attitude toward life.
But how can you give this perspective to younger people, students?
I don't know how
without
if I could bottle it and distribute it in pill form or liquid form, I'd do so. I'd be a very rich man. I don't know how you do it without time and experience. And some knowledge, somebody giving you information. It's one of the things that I remember early in my career. Watching fellow journalists, I was the youngest person in the newsroom. These other people had been out that I was working with or sitting next to had been out at other newspapers for years before they got to the Washington Post. And they had to come with a clip file, 5 or 6, 7 years of work before they were even considered. I didn't have anything to show. A city editor took a chance on me, and that was it. One of the things that I heard, I think it was hearsay to me, but it was Ben Bradley, the executive editor who eventually became the executive editor of the Washington Post. At this time, in the 60s, he was the managing editor. And he told someone who told me, he said, you're not going to get very far in this industry, journalism, unless you're willing to take risk. If you're going to play it safe, then you're going to probably end up doing obituaries at night on weekends, and that's when the paper is telling you to leave. But if you take risk, and you take risks to get the big story, that's what you have to be prepared to do. And I took that seriously. I took risk in terms of going after stories that I didn't know I was going to be successful on. And a number of times I flopped. I thought there was a story there. I went after it. My editors gave me the time to work on it, and I came up with those stories. And that was embarrassing, but I was willing to I didn't stop taking risks. I continued to take risks. And most of the risks panned out, or I became more experienced and willing to understand that I had the elements of the story at the beginning, and now I had to get the meat of the story. Yeah. Like when I did the adolescent childbearing series, I knew I approached 13 families. That was intentional, many families. And after a couple of months, I dropped 7 families from the project because it was just too unwieldy. And there were 11 children each of 2 families in this 13 families. I kept one of the families with 11 children and discarded one of the families with 11 children. But I knew from my access and the kinds of information I was getting from these people that this was going to be a tremendous immersion storytelling piece when I sat down to write it. And I just knew it was going to be a blockbuster. And it was. I angered a lot of people. A lot of people said it was about time that I wrote this truth. So it had a mixed reception, but that was fine with me, as long as the truth was out there in print for people to read. Because when I started journalism, I thought I could right all the wrongs in the world and make everything great. And then after a while, I realized that that was not going to happen. So then I really reduced my goals to just informing the public. And that's part of humility. The only thing I'm doing is informing the public. Whether they want to accept it as truth or not is their choice, but at least I've informed them.
When you were an active journalist at the Washington Post, did you have an optimistic view of the society or more pessimistic one?
It became more cynical over time with experience. I ended up filing a discrimination complaint against the Washington Post in '72, March of '72. Myself and 6 other black reporters filed a discrimination complaint with the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission in March of 1972 because I could see that we were stacked up on the city desk and we were not going anywhere. There was no provision for us to move off the city desk onto the foreign desk, the national desk, sports desk, and so on. And it was rigidly segregated. And it was given lip service. We were given lip service about integration. What alienated me and made me very cynical was the same lip service I had heard in '68 before I went into the Peace Corps. Right. When myself and another reporter named Jesse Lewis confronted the executive editor and the managing editor about the fact that there was no real upward mobility among the black reporters. Why was that? And he assured us that he'd be making changes and things would happen. So that was in the fall of '68. And I left that fall, end of September 1968, and came back in February 1971. Nothing had happened. There had been no changes. And that's when I began working with the other black reporters to organize, to confront management in a public way. Because the day we filed the complaint against the Washington Post as a discriminatory employer, we held a press conference and announced our filing of the complaint. It was the first type of complaint ever filed against a major newspaper in America. We announced our complaint at a 10 a.m. press conference, and then when the press conference was over, we went back to work. And it was broadcast on the evening news, at least in Washington, that evening, and it was covered by major newspapers and wire services. So then the EEOC, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, did its own investigation, and they issued a report in November of 1972, branding the Post a discriminatory employer, and the Post began making changes. They refused to negotiate a settlement with us, but they began to make changes in the newsroom, significant changes. Blacks were being brought in to work on the national desk, foreign desk, in the sports department. I was shifted out to cover one of the major counties in area of subscription, Montgomery County, Maryland, which at that time, in '72, had the highest per capita income of any other county in the United States. So it was a plum assignment. And I did everything, and I enjoyed it. I covered everything, not just civil rights and crime, but everything that went on in daily life in a major suburban jurisdiction. And I went from that to living with guerrillas in Angola in '73. So I was having a ball. I was having a good time. I was surprised I wasn't fired. They didn't fire any of us. I was surprised that I thought
that would have just backfired for them, right?
They would have retaliated, because I asked my wife, I was still married, I asked my wife at the time, "You ready to go on welfare? Because I don't know after this whether I'm going to be employed." And she was doing a master's in public health nutrition at the University of Maryland in College Park. She said, "Well, I hope we don't have to go on welfare." I said, "I hope so too." But they didn't fire us.
This is interesting. So last year we talked to a professor in advertising, and we were talking about how the public perception of the Black community has evolved over time, and how it started as they were discouraged and you wouldn't see them in any advertisements or anything, and then slowly over time
in my youth,
right,
you didn't see any blacks in advertising. Yeah.
And now that you mentioned that these companies had to, because of the complaint that you filed, Washington Post, for example, had to change, and they started bringing more Black Americans
into the newsroom.
Exactly. So it all goes hand in hand.
Anchors is for broadcast.
Okay.
You don't have anchors in...
Right. Not in newsrooms, yeah. So like I feel like it all goes hand in hand, where like all these movements are like, even though they're happening in different parts of the country, but they're like all coming together with the, like I can see it going.
Well, I saw it as a progression because the civil rights movement was really banging on the door for us to get in.
Right.
Then they hired some of us and we were in. Now we had to change the institutions that we had been hired to work in, right? So the civil rights, I saw ourselves as an extension of the civil rights movement, because until the 60s, the Washington Post had never hired, well, they had one black reporter, a guy named Simeon Booker in the mid-50s. And he had to use a segregated bathroom in the building. He couldn't use the bathroom everybody else used in the newsroom. So you can imagine what his life was like. And Washington, D.C. is a southern city. People don't recognize it as southern because it's the capital of the United States, but it's a very southern city. And so everything that was discriminatory throughout the South was in place in Washington, D.C. itself. Yeah, so I saw ourselves, when we filed our complaint in '72, as an extension of all the demonstrations and confrontations that took place beginning in '55 with the Montgomery, Alabama bus boycott up until the assassination of King in '68.
Did your initiative with the other reporters start initiatives in other newspapers?
Yes. Well, one of the first things that happened is that the white women at the Washington Post organized right behind us in terms of patriarchy, being denied, treated as second-class citizens because they were women, based on gender. And then blacks and women at the New York Times also began to organize, all in reaction to ours. Now, those are the only definite lines that I knew that came out of our movement, were the women at the Washington Post organizing and making gains, and the blacks and the women at the New York Times organizing and confronting management. So those two developments came directly out of our confrontation with the Washington Post.
And if you guys didn't do that, how long, who knows how long it would have taken?
Power doesn't yield to discussion, and I already knew that. Just from my coursework at Howard University, one of the things that in the course I took was how do you change societies? Do you go along and sort of acquiesce and keep quiet, or do you, what brings the best result? Confrontation or going along? And always when you looked at the results, historically it was confrontation. So I knew that we had to confront the Washington Post. Having any more discussions with Ben Bradley, we're going nowhere. He'd give us what I say is a song and dance, and that would be it. Yeah. Till he put pressure on his newsroom managers, nothing was going to happen.
I think that is a very important lesson today, because there seems to be a lot of indifference between younger people, like the university doesn't do X or whatever system they're part of. They don't seem to do the thing that they want or whatever, within reason, obviously, but they seem to just kind of go along and not.
Oh, the students?
Right, like younger.
Well, that's a different generation.
Yeah.
Students in the '60s.
Or no, right now, like today.
Yeah. So you're Generation Z, right? Aren't you?
Yes.
Correct, yes.
Yeah. When was Generation Z born? When?
So 1995 until present.
Okay.
Around then.
Right. So would you say that Generation Z is complacent about the world around them?
I wouldn't
What
say
about
so.
climate change?
Yeah.
Are they not energized by the difficulty in getting everybody to get together on climate change?
I mean,
you're not too sure.
I'm not convinced. I mean, that's what you read in the news and stuff like that, but I'm not sure. Like, if you go on the quad, for instance, and talk to people, how many of them are actually? I mean, I don't know. I'm not convinced on that. But I think it's an important lesson that like confrontation and peaceful confrontation as a way to, lead create change. It's like something that
Or
we've
create change. Yeah.
to create change. It's something that we've forgotten. Something that I found interesting just from talking to you right now is that you have a really good memory about dates, about people's names.
It gets on my friends' nerves because they say we don't understand how you can remember all these dates. And so
What's that about?
I do.
You don't know, just naturally, or what?
Yeah, it's natural to me. Yeah, it might have. People assume that because I was a journalist working journalist for 32 years, so that's where it came from. But it started for me well before I began working as a journalist. Like I gave you the date for the March on Washington. I was 19. I was working as a journalist. I was a student at Lincoln University in Pennsylvania. I transferred from Lincoln to Howard University in '65. But so I participated on the March in Washington on August 28th, 1963, and I'll always remember that date.
Yeah.
I remember. Have you ever heard of Black American fathers having the talk with their sons about what they will face in the street? It's called the talk. I remember when that happened. That happened in August 1958 when I was 14. I was going out of the house, we lived in Harlem at the time, out of the apartment. My father stopped me and said, look, come here, I want to talk to you. He said, you're bigger than most of the fellows that you hang out with, and I want you to be cool if you ever stop by policemen and they begin asking you questions. I don't want you flying off the handle and give them a reason to hit you or beat you. He didn't enter shoot you, but it was implied. And he said, well, if you're stopped by a white policeman, you won't be treated fairly. But I want you to get out of that situation in one piece. So I want you to cooperate with the policeman. And this tape always runs in the back. I can hear his voice right in the moment. It runs in the back of my head. I want you to cooperate with the policeman until you can get away from him. All right? Don't mouth off. Don't call him any names, because all you're going to do is set yourself up for more difficulty and perhaps be hurt. So now I didn't believe him. I thought that applied to his generation. I sat there and listened to him, and I said, no, that doesn't apply to me. No one's going to beat me. You kidding? That's my arrogance. Yeah, youthful arrogance and lack of information. I didn't know. Ignorant, really. But then as I got older, I saw these things playing out, and I was stopped driving for no reason, any number of times in Washington. And it was mainly a white police force in Washington. Metropolitan Police Department was mainly white, very few black officers at the time in '65. Again, Washington is a southern city. And they'd see me driving a car and pull me over and stop me and want to see my registration and license, and everything was in order. And then, okay, go ahead. What were you going to do? You just went along, and whenever that happened, the tape played. As much as it annoyed me, I could hear my father telling me, remain calm, don't lose your temper, because you're only going to make it worse. Yeah. So that took place for me when I was 14, 1958. August. I don't know the day in August, but it was it was a weekend afternoon. Yeah.
Did you have a habit of writing growing up? Did you journal?
Only I had essay courses, of course, in high school. I went to a private high school. My parents, well, this is fortuitous. My father said all of my education up until the 8th grade had been in Harlem, including the 8th grade. I went to PS 1. People from New York when they say PS. You know what PS stands for? Public school. I went to PS 133 and then PS 138 for junior high school. And my father said, I was getting good grades. My father said, he asked me a civics question in the 8th grade when I was in the 8th grade at Frederick Douglass Junior High School in Harlem. And he said my answer didn't make any sense. Like he could see that I didn't have a basic civics education. And he became alarmed because he had gone to school in Harlem and he had gotten pretty good education, he felt. And he couldn't imagine the education system deteriorating in Harlem in one generation. So then he made moves to move me up to the North Bronx to go to Oldville Junior High School in the North Bronx, which is a pretty good school in a neighborhood that was mainly at that time dominated by Italian Americans. And then my parents sent me to Rhodes Prep, which was in Midtown Manhattan. So I went to Rhodes Prep, 10th, 11th, and 12th grade. So there was a lot of writing at Rhodes Prep, but in English courses, where you expect not the literature courses, but the writing courses, a lot of essay writing, parts of a sentence. Yeah.
But not personal?
No. I did it, I was doing an academic diploma. And to do an academic diploma, you had to take a series of statewide exams called the Regents exams. So I was busy preparing myself for the Regents exams only. I wasn't thinking about a writing career. You needed to take the exam at the spring semester, at the end of the spring semester or the end of spring, before school went out, sometime in, I think, May, before school ended out in June. You had to take, for your major courses, you had to take the Regent exam. If you didn't pass all the Regent exams, you would not get an academic diploma. And I said, I need that academic diploma for whatever reason. Because my intention was to go to college, yeah.
In the book that you mentioned that you wrote about teens,
teen adolescent childbearing. I no longer call it teen pregnancy because none of the kids that I studied got pregnant accidentally.
Correct.
So I call it adolescent childbearing because they got pregnant with the intention of having a child. Yeah.
Correct. So that's where my question comes in. So right now, so usually when countries become more developed, the replacement rates go down, and that's what's happening in the U.S. People are not having as many kids anymore.
Becoming industrialized, yeah.
Correct. So that's something that
they have 1.5 children. I don't know how they do. They figure middle class people have 1.5 children. I don't know how they do that. But go ahead.
Yeah, who knows? It's just maybe like a half of a children. I don't know. Who knows?
Right. Only the top half gets born.
Well, that's what the statisticians say. But go ahead.
In your book that you wrote is that you wrote that this adolescents they do want to have these kids.
Yeah, well, these are poor blacks.
Correct.
So they're not middle class at all. You take them out of that category altogether, yeah.
Completely understand, but what was the reasoning behind them just...
The intention.
Oh, because one of the things that they all said when the child was born, both the father's an adolescent and the mother's an adolescent, they said that I'm grown now. So they saw it as a rite of passage into adulthood. In a world where they were not going to have too many rites of passage. They were poor. This was a poor black neighborhood, one of the poorest black neighborhoods in Washington, D.C. Schools were very, very deficient. They didn't see much of a future for themselves, and they knew it. They were cynical enough and aware enough to know that they didn't have much future, that they were not competitive in the American job market. They knew that. One of the kids in the study, Charlie Williams, I remember this conversation the two of us were having. He was about 17, 18, had already fathered several children with different girls. And I was playing devil's advocate with him, and I said, well, why don't you try to get a job, because you got to support these children. And he said, get a job doing what? I said, well, at least you could get a commercial truck driver's license and become a commercial truck driver. Long distance or short distance? And he said, see, that's how much you know. So what do you mean? He said, I don't read well enough to take the truck driver's license. I can pass the physical part, shifting the gears, I know how to do that, but I can't sit down, I don't read. And it never crossed my mind, because he had dropped out of high school. How do you go from kindergarten, first grade, all the way to high school and then drop out and don't know how to read? Because I knew enough that if you made it to the third grade of elementary school, that's from the first to the third grade, you're learning to read. After the third grade, you're reading to learn, particularly when you hit junior high school. Well, he had been through all of that and had never been taught to read. How do you do that? So he'd been socially promoted and never learned to read. He was totally incapable of reading, illiterate. But those kinds of things never occurred to me until I actually saw it face to face. Rosa, the woman I spent 4 years with, she couldn't read. Same scenario. She had never been taught to read.
And that almost takes a whole dimension of you know, of the world, of being able to read it and what you see, what you understand, what you remember. You know, I'm curious. So you became, in all these interviews, you were talking to many people from, you know, different backgrounds, different, you know, ways of life, and I'm sure they were not. I would assume that they were not easy to talk or get to know them.
Or open up.
No, it's really very, very, very easy for me to get to know them.
So what was your?
It was just my personality. I don't know. When I say I approached 13 families, there were 13 families willing to come into the project. Well, I approached 22 families, and 13 of the 22 families came into the adolescent childbearing project, and I decided to drop 7. Well, that's quite a large number of people willing to talk about their personal lives, because I was very clear on what I was doing. I was doing a study on adolescent childbearing. No, at the time I would say, before I had done the research, I was going to be doing a series of articles on teenage pregnancy. And all of the families that I approached, there were already teenagers in the families who had children. And one family did not. And the girl in that family who was trying to had convinced me, that's how naive I was, that she didn't want to have any children until she graduated from high school and got married. But when she was telling me that, she was a senior in high school, and she was actively trying to become pregnant. But she misled me, you know, like all the teenagers lied to me across the board. And they weren't really to tell me the truth until I'd interviewed them, each one of them about 4 or 5 months into the project. So I'm very easy. I see myself as very easy to get along with. I wasn't being very aggressive. I approached a teenager at a Baptist church, and she began connecting me in this one community called Washington Highlands with other teenagers that she knew were pregnant or had children. And I approached them, and I talked to them about what I was doing and why Tasha had given me their name, and I'd be interested in them coming into the project. But before they came into the project, I had to meet with their parents or parent, because some of the teenagers was growing up in a 2-parent household or a single female-headed household. So then I'd sit down and talk to the parents. One parent was hostile to what I was doing, so that was not going anywhere. You know, I never understood his hostility, because his wife wanted to come into the project, but he didn't want anyone in his family to come into the project. And so out of the 22 families that I approached, 13 said yes. The parents said yes. I had to get the parents' permission, because I didn't want anybody seeing. I was in my 40s at the time, and me running around with teenage girls, I didn't want any accusations that I was a pedophile. So I wanted the parents fully on board with what I was doing. And I moved into the community. I was living there in a roach-infested basement apartment. I killed all the roaches in the apartment eventually. But that was the nature of the community that I was living in. It was people living in rundown housing, and rundown private housing, which is where I was living, and rundown public housing.
Did they ever see it as, like, did they ever feel shameful of being pregnant, getting pregnant so early, or did they, like, their parents?
Well, I imagine they would feel shameful if they were middle class. That would be a middle class value, shame. And middle class always tends to think that their values are universal.
Right.
The middle class values are not universal among the poor. Mm-hmm. They live by a different standard. They're not even included in the aspirations of being middle class. So no, they didn't feel shame.
Even the parents, they would be okay with their...
No, particularly the mothers were very opposed to their daughters becoming pregnant, because the mothers in every case had been adolescent mothers. And they knew how hard it had been for them once the reality
kicks in.
And the child is here. And it's not something you send back after 30 days.
Right.
Get your money back. The child is with you for at least the next 18 years. And they tried to keep their daughters from becoming pregnant. But their daughters decided they wanted children and intentionally got pregnant. And that led to a lot of conflict between mothers and daughters. And then eventually it just sort of died down because now you have to consider the child. Child is not at fault for any of this. And then oftentimes when the mother would get very angry with her daughter when she was pregnant, the daughter's first comeback was, well, you had me when you were 16, what's the issue? And so the mother, what was the mother going to say? Except be very angry with with the daughter for confronting her with her own adolescent choice. Yeah.
And do you think what changed or how the mindset changed over the years was just because of education? Do you think that's why it might have gotten progressively better? Or do you think?
You mean the decline in adolescent childbearing?
Yes.
I don't know. I didn't study that. I studied, when I did the study was in the mid-'80s. I moved into Washington Highlands, into that basement apartment in July of '84. I moved out a year later. And I continued doing the interviews until a week before the series ran in January of '86. So since then, at that time, adolescent childbearing in all poor communities, black and white, was going up. And now several years later, it leveled off, and now it's declined. Why the decline, or why it even leveled off, I have no idea. I moved on to other projects. Yeah.
Two questions on that. So the reason why I ask you about getting how do you get the people that you work with on those projects, like those families, to open up, was because we usually have, not usually, but sometimes we have a hard time talking to our guests because they don't seem to want to open up. So they're professors or students or people. So do you have any?
Well, let me give you, well, as you may notice, I can sit here and talk about anything for any length of time and be responsive and even volunteer information that you haven't asked. So in interacting with the adolescent parents and with their parents was very easy for me. And sit down in the living room, talk. Eventually, during the project, I would take everybody out for multiple meals on my expense account at the Washington Post, the parents and the children in the family. So that they would look forward to that, because they really had that opportunity to go out and eat in a restaurant, because that's how tight things were in the budget. So I remember one parent, Tasha's stepfather, said to me, "Boy, you have an American Express Gold Card." Now, I didn't realize the significance of that. To me, it was just a tool to do the work that I'm doing, but to him, it was a big deal. And it sort of surprised me. If I had known he was going to have that reaction, I never would have used some other credit card, for paying for the meal. Right? So all I needed was a receipt to get reimbursed by the Washington Post. So any card would have done. So you become aware of, and I never lorded over people. Both the parents and the teenagers saw me as a middle-class black male who worked for the Washington Post. And he's come here because he thinks adolescent childbearing is a crisis. And they didn't see it as a crisis, as an urban crisis. So I don't know what to tell you. I got along with the 6 families. I developed a very good rapport with all of them. And it didn't matter. Whenever I showed up, the teenagers are notorious for not keeping time and not keeping schedules. And I'd make an appointment with one of the teenagers, and I'd show up at the house, and that teenager wasn't there at that time. But one other family member was there, and I said, "What are you doing?" And they'd say, "I'm not doing anything." "Well, come on with me. So-and-so's not here, but I'll take you to dinner or take you to lunch. Let's go to Red Lobster, get some shrimp." And they said, "Oh yeah, okay." So it didn't matter who was home, because I was interviewing everyone in the family, multiple times. Well, let me add this too. I developed a system of interviewing that was multiple interviews. I started the first interview with parents and every child in the family. I started the first interview with, what is your earliest childhood memory attending school? Figuring that was a relatively neutral area to begin in. Then the second interview would be a day or two later. What is your earliest childhood memory growing up in your family? Then the third interview would be, what is your earliest childhood memory being introduced to religion? Or if not religion, a worldview or an ethical view. And then the fourth interview would be, what is your earliest childhood memory growing up outside the family? And the most important section in there was your adolescence, when you became sexually aware, interested in boys, interested in girls. When you would react to peer pressure. And at the end of that interview, I would have a sense of whether you were conformist or nonconformist, whether you could be easily manipulated by peer pressure, or peer pressure was very important to you, or it wasn't important to you. And after I do those 4 interviews, then the real interview begins. Because now I have a construction of this person in 4 areas, 4 very important areas of their lives. The 2 most important of the 4 areas was growing up in the family, growing up outside the family. But I had to do the school history and the church or religion history to complete the whole. And then after that, I follow that with focus interviews. Now generally, not all the time, but classically, between the 3rd and the 4th interview, the person began to contradict what they told me in interviews 1 and 2. Yeah. And then I wouldn't indicate that I was focusing in on the contradictions, and I wouldn't call them contradictions. And I wouldn't say to them, that's not what you told me 2 weeks ago, I would listen carefully and say, aha. Because I saw the contradiction as the person being
more open,
more willing to tell me something closer to the truth. So I teach this type of interviewing here now. And as I tell my students, you never get anybody to tell you the absolute truth. People who've been married 100 years don't tell each other the absolute truth. That's how they're able to remain married for 100 years. So keep that in mind when you marry. But you want something closer to the truth. Something that's not very flattering. When people begin telling you things about themselves that are not very flattering, then you really know you've made a breakthrough. Yeah. And so then I do multiple interviews after those 4 structured interviews that are focused on the contradictions that they've shared with me. But I never refer to them. I said, I was very interested in what you said the other day about so-and-so and so-and-so, and how you don't get along with your stepfather. Let's talk a little more about that. Because something came out in maybe the 3rd session when we were talking about religion, that the person indicated he or she didn't like the stepfather. And that was part of the reason. I don't know if they offered it as a rationale for becoming pregnant or part of their defiance. One young adult woman, she was not a teenager when I interviewed her in the project, but she had a child when she was 14. And she had intentionally gotten pregnant to show her mother that her mother's choke chain on her social life wouldn't work. And that was a 14-year-old adolescent. It's a child's decision. But she got pregnant and was happy she was pregnant because her mother had her on a choke chain, trying to keep her from getting pregnant.
I think the key here is just time. And
time is a big element.
Yeah.
Time and patience.
Yeah.
Patience, particularly when you know people are lying to you. Let's take Sharita Grant, for example. I'm still in touch with her. We exchange messages every week on Facebook. She's now a grandmother, but when I met her, she was 17 and she had been a mother for 3 years. Had her first child when she was 15. And then I attended her wedding when she married when she was 20. And then she had 2 daughters with her husband, and then she and her husband divorced. And she raised the 2 girls on her own. She had a young boy, Marquise. When I interviewed her, she was living with her stepmother and her 2 sisters, 2 half-sisters by her father. And her older sister, Patricia, sat in on the interview. She sat in the living room on my left in an overstuffed chair. And I was interviewing Sharita at the dining room table in the stepmother's apartment. And I was taking the mother through the school, I was taking Sharita through the school history. I took her through year by year. And when we got to the 7th grade, Sharita started talking about this course she had in human sexuality. And of course, this was not available to me when I was a student in 7th grade. So I was paying close attention to what she had to say. Now, she had told me that her mother had never told her anything about human sexuality. She got pregnant by her boyfriend, William Wheeler, when she was 15, and when she was 14, and she had the baby when she was 15, and he abandoned her. And she was totally ignorant about anything about birth control or human sexuality until she began having sex with her boyfriend. So we're going through her school history year by year, and she lost sight of what she had already told me. And when we got to the 7th grade, she started telling me about this course on human sexuality at junior high school. I'm trying to think of the name of the junior high school. I lost again. And she told me all the details that she learned in this course, including every form of birth control. The teachers were very explicit with all of the students because they were working against teenage pregnancy in this very poor community. And so I listened to all of it very carefully. And then I said very quietly to her, and the tape recorder was going. I said, so when you got pregnant 4 years later, you knew what you were doing. And suddenly she realized that she had uncovered herself inadvertently. She had lied to me about how she became pregnant. She became pregnant out of ignorance. And here she was telling me that 4 years before she got pregnant, she knew everything about human sexuality and birth control. She didn't know what to do. And so she hit her head and turned her face to the wall and hid her face from me, right? I just sat there quietly. Her older sister, Pat, fell on the floor laughing because Pat knew the truth. And it had been so easy to unmask Sharita. And Sharita composed herself, and then turned around and looked at me with a straight face and said, no, when I got pregnant, I had forgotten everything. And I said, oh, okay. So let's move on to the 8th grade. That was the way she wanted to handle it. I had to wait till she was ready to tell me the truth. I didn't badger her or try to get it out of her. But now I knew that she hadn't gotten pregnant out of ignorance.
Have there been attempts, like not related to just this case study, but just over the years where the people that you've interviewed or the parties or anyone who's involved with it has tried to like destroy the evidence or like try to sabotage your journalism?
That hasn't happened. Not at all.
Where the story is like, if it ever comes out, it would be bad for them or...
No, I remember Sheila Matthews was confronted at a bus stop. She was one of the adolescent mothers I interviewed. She was confronted at a bus stop waiting for the bus by a woman who recognized her from the photos that ran with the story. And the woman started berating her for telling me what she told me. And Sheila ended up cussing her out, calling her everything but a child of God, and told her to get out of her face before she kicked her ass. So these were tough kids. No, you didn't come around pushing them around. They opened up talking about Sheila Matthews. Her mother called me. This is after the project had been published. Her mother called me, Audrey, and asked me to speak to Sheila about a job training opportunity that Sheila had, and she wasn't interested in, wouldn't take it. And I forget what it was. It was some level of nursing training. So I called Sheila, and this is before I had a cell phone, so I was calling her at her parents' house. I spoke to her. She said, well, I want to take you out to dinner and talk to you about this job opportunity. She said, okay, I'll go with you to dinner, but I don't want you lecturing me. And I said, I won't lecture you. Well, that was not true. I just wanted to convince her. So she ended up taking the job. I talked to her in a very gentle way, not like her mother was pounding her. And she and her mother had a contentious relationship. Her mother was furious with Sheila for getting pregnant. She had done everything to to keep that from happening. She felt. So I took her to one of her favorite eating places, I forget what it was, and just talked to her about the job opportunity and what that would mean to her and her son Petey, and so on and so on. So she went and did it, but I didn't badger her, and that was the big thing.
What do you learn about human psychology in the sense of, we have a friend, for some context, so we have a friend, both of his parents are physicists, and these parents never told their son about physics or engineering or anything like that.
So they wanted him to make up his own mind. They weren't pushing him or trying to impose their world on his. Yeah.
Correct. And the funny thing is that the guy ended up studying physics.
Yeah, because he's around physicists. But they discussed some aspects of their work around in front of him at the dinner table, at least, didn't they?
They said that they never mentioned because they wanted.
But he knew what they did.
No, he didn't. He found out when they knew they were engineers, but he didn't know that they studied physics. Okay. So he found out when he came to college, and then he asked, "Oh, well, what do you study?" Physics. Like both of his parents.
Oh well, I can't tell you that.
But I'm asking.
I can't answer that question. Yeah.
Me neither. But I'm asking in the context of because like these families that they really try to change. Like they wanted their kids and their families to not make the same mistakes that they did.
Yeah, but they were all stuck in poverty. And these children saw having a child, both the boys and the girls, as a rite of passage. And none of them were prepared for anything through the public school system that served that poor area. The area is called Washington Highlands in Washington. It was, I don't know if it is now, it was one of the poorest sections of Washington. And that's where they sent the teachers that couldn't be fired because they had tenure. And they weren't really teaching the kids. There were a few kids who were in what would be the equivalent of advanced placement, and they were called derisively by the majority of students as brainiacs, but they were a very small number. And there were no pregnancies, no childbearing among them. They were as sexually active as the students who were doing very poorly in school. But if they became pregnant, they got an abortion. Why? Because they had a post-secondary future. They had a future after high school, whereas the other kids that I was studying knew they had no future. I think I mentioned earlier that the kids were very cynical, but they knew they were not competitive in the American job market. So, I mean, as much as a parent is fighting against his or her daughter getting pregnant, or his or her son having a child, the circumstances and the social environment they're growing up in militates against that.
Earlier this week, we were talking about how, in many ways, it's like whether or not you can do something or not. It's really whether, like, what you think of your outlook on and your perspective about life. So some of these kids, they were in the AP classes, and they really wanted to have a better future. But the other kids, perhaps, if they could have, if they had a more, optimistic future, they could have, have a better present life. How can you instill confidence and trust and having that, just being excited about the future for younger people?
I don't have an answer for you because I tried to figure that answer when I was doing the adolescent childbearing study. And I realized that you'd have to have major intervention in each household. And I didn't see that as physically possible. So the only possible avenue was to invest, not a capital investment, but invest in the education of kids growing up in poverty. But I also knew, this is why I think that's the easiest approach, or perhaps the most productive approach. But I also know that most public education in the United States is run through property taxes. And those property taxes are collected from the middle class. You will not be superintendent more than one day if you divert funds collected from the middle class into poor communities. The minute the middle class finds out about that, you're out of office.
So you're saying that used to happen? Or
no, it hasn't happened.
Okay.
It hasn't happened the way it needs to happen. Yeah. You know that most public school systems are run by property taxes in the United States. They're contributions by the federal government, But most of this running of the schools, the money is devoted to the schools, the salaries of the teachers and the administrators come from the collection of property taxes of individual homeowners. So most of the money is collected from the middle class or even the working class. They're not going to stand for you taking their money, their tax money, and devoting it to rectifying centuries of neglect toward the poor. Just not going to happen. You, as a superintendent of schools, you just committed suicide once they find out about it.
Yeah, because it's eventually their money that's coming back to them in some way, right?
How?
Not for the poor.
If the money is directed at the poor, it's not coming back to them.
Yeah.
So a lot of for instance, the childbearing was because of the lack of a rite of passage. I see similarities to, today's society in the sense of for instance, my class of high school, we didn't have graduation, which in a way that serves as.
Where'd you go to high school?
We didn't have graduation because of COVID. So like the whole.
Oh, okay. So
the whole.
Everything was on Zoom, and you didn't have the.
Right, because of COVID, and so like.
Where was this?
In Chicago.
Chicago, okay.
But I mean, throughout the world, no one had graduations because of COVID.
Right.
So that wasn't as the rite of passage, but in general, we seem to be losing this rite of passages. So, do you think how can we create this rite of passages for people, and so people don't have to?
Only if they see they have an opportunity. What is the rite of passage for? Prepare you for the next stage of life. Well, if you don't see this, the next stage of your life is still the same dead end before the rite of passage, then why take the rite of passage? Or why not select your own? Why not select a parallel universe or a parallel reward system that says having a child early in life is an important factor and it turns you into an adult? That's how you begin to think. Because going to college or getting a good civil service job is not in the works for you. Particularly if your reading is not up to par. And these kids knew it. I mean, when I told you about Charlie Williams telling me, I don't read well enough to take the driving part of the commercial truck driver's license. That's quite an admission. So where does he look for achievement for himself, besides having babies? Or stick up banks, or dealing drugs, or sticking up drug dealers? That's a very short life.
Was there something in particular that drew you to these stories? Maybe the adolescent childbearing or Rosalie?
Well, when I came back, I was an African correspondent from 79 to 84. When I came back from Africa, I was working on the foreign desk as an assistant foreign editor. That's a boring job because you're editing other people's copy.
Right.
And at the time, 84, January 84, there were a lot of stories being written about high levels of adolescent childbearing in poor communities, in poor black communities. And I was reading the rationales or the reasons given by experts, quote unquote experts, about why children were having children. And they rang hollow to me. They didn't make sense to me. Remember, I grew up in Harlem.
Right.
And I wasn't poor because I had two working parents. My father worked in the post office. My mother was a registered nurse with the New York City Health Department. So we were living in Harlem because we were segregated by ethnicity. So, but I went to public school from the first to the 8th grade. And I went to public school with a lot of kids who were very poor. They either lived in public housing nearby or they lived in tenements, walk-up tenements, 6-story tenements. And one of the things that the experts were saying were that these girls were becoming mothers because they lived in grim, dire circumstances, and they were easily manipulable by the adolescent teenage boys that were in their community. Well, I just said, that doesn't make any sense. That sounds very sexist to me. I grew up in Harlem, and I interacted with a lot of girls who were very poor. And you weren't convincing them to do anything that they didn't want to do. Right. They were very tough. They were tougher than some of the boys. If you didn't treat them right, they would put they, they I've seen a number of these girls beat up boys. The boys were equal height and equal weight, so it was an even fight, which surprised me when I first saw it. So these were tough girls. So I saw that explanation of sexist, and people who were ignorant didn't know better. When I did the adolescent childbearing study, it was 6 families involved in it. None of the adolescent mothers in those 6 families had been manipulated into having a child. They all had decided before the boyfriend that they were going to have a child, and informed the boyfriend that they were going to have a child. And in a number of cases, the boyfriends tried to talk them out of it and said, we're too young to be having children. And they said, well, I've decided to have it. Sheila Matthews told her boyfriend Mario, I've decided to have a child, and I've decided you're going to be the father. And he laughed at her. But she knew that his routine was to take chances. And a number of times he took chances and she got pregnant. She knew that was going to happen.
I do want to talk about Rosa Lee Cunningham. In one instance that I found interesting in the whole story is a story of Alvin and Eric, I believe.
Now, Alvin is dead. He died of diabetes in 2013.
Oh.
Eric is still alive. He's retired. He was a school bus driver for handicapped children. Okay. And he's retired and moved to Rocky Mount, North Carolina. I'm still very much in touch with the family, as you can tell.
Perfect.
Yeah, yeah.
So something that I found very interesting about the story is how peer pressure actually had a positive impact in the lives of Alvin and Eric. Okay. You mentioned at one point that I believe it was Alvin that he never went to the truck to get the food because the brothers thought he was being lazy when in reality he was ashamed.
He was ashamed of it. He didn't want his girlfriend and her parents. This is in the era in the 1950s where welfare poor and working poor lived together in public housing. And the working poor were one step above the welfare poor. And if you were identified as welfare poor, that meant you were at the bottom of the pole. So going to the food truck, to get the surplus food from the federal government, Department of Agriculture, cheese and beans mainly, identified you as welfare poor. This is before food stamps. Food stamps came in with Lyndon Johnson's Great Society in the 1960s. But before that, you got surplus food from the Department of Agriculture as a welfare-dependent family. So Alvin didn't want to be identified as a welfare-dependent family because the girl that he liked and had a crush on, her family was working poor, and they looked down on welfare dependents. He knew that. So he didn't want, and her living room window overlooked where the truck would stop. So he didn't want her parents or her mother or her father, whoever was home, seeing him go to the welfare truck, what was called the welfare truck, because then that would identify him as being in a welfare-dependent family. So that's very early on. That's 3rd, 4th grade. He's developed a class consciousness, which I found extraordinary. And in part, it rescued him because he knew what he wanted to achieve, and he wanted to get out of the circumstances that he grew up in. Something else that was happening, because he was so quiet, when he had friends from school invite middle-class friends in public school. Again, this is ethnic segregation. So you have poor people, working people, you have poor blacks, working class blacks, and middle class blacks all living in the same community, all attending their children all attending the same elementary school. So he had friendships with some of the middle class black kids, and when he would go to their house, and parents treated him well because they saw him as quiet and well mannered. He was just quiet and introverted. But they interpreted it as good manners. He was invited to join the family to eat. And he realized that they turned the television off and everyone sat down at a table and they had flatware to eat with. When Bobby was raising, Rosalie's oldest son was raising him, he just gave them a bowl of whatever. They couldn't identify what was in the bowl and sit them in front of the television with a bowl and a spoon and said, "Yeah, that's dinner." Whereas when he went to middle class homes, it was very different. Something else he noticed in middle class homes, there weren't a lot of children. And when he visited his friend, all of his toys were intact, they were not broken. That didn't happen in his house. And he had one bed in his bedroom, and that was his bed, the friend's bed, whereas Alvin had to share the bed with all the other boys. And some of them were still wetting the bed, so you go to bed and wake up all wet with urine. It was not very pleasant. So he noticed this different lifestyle, and he recognized very early on that this is something he wanted to achieve. Some people read about Alvin and Eric and think the Army changed them. No, they were changed before they got to the Army. That's why they got into the Army, yeah.
Have you, that makes me wonder, could you use, quote unquote, peer pressure to do other, good?
I don't see how. Again, you'd have to go into every family.
Right.
You'd have to be involved in every family that's in this circumstance. And I don't know that you'd have the number of people capable of doing that. It's enough now for overworked social workers who have caseloads that are too large for them to have any real impact. So I don't see it happening.
Another interesting aspect of Rosa Lee that I found was she really lived in the present to the point where at some point it was all about survival. At some point her customer was there and asked about the daughter, and then the rest of the story.
You mean when she prostituted Patty?
Correct.
Yeah, Patty was 11 and was an adult man, yeah.
Correct. And the reason was that she would pay more, and she saw that as a mean of survival. And that living in the present, and that was something that we see more in the sphere of society today. We see a lot more people being aware of living in the present and so on and so forth.
Well, how do you feel that it's more so today than it was when Rosa Lee was alive and when she was living?
I do not know, but I would assume that it has become more relevant due to the fact that there's more inclination for people to be meditating and actually, yeah, I'm not quite sure.
Or maybe social media, the impact of social media has
Right.
us living more in the present.
Right. So
I'm guessing. I don't know. I've not something I've read about or studied, so I'm just guessing.
right.
I'm following your lead, but I'm
Right.
guessing.
Yeah, so I would say that there's this notion of telling people you should live in the present and you should meditate and you should not care about.
Meditation is for the middle class.
Correct.
It's not for the poor.
Completely understand.
Poor will be quick to tell you to take your meditation and go out the door with it. I started to say something else, but go ahead.
But I'm just seeing a lot of patterns from, let's say, like as you define it, like the poor, that is showing up in the middle class today. And not just in the present thing, but just in many ways. So you can go in the quad and ask any student whether they know what meditation is or whether they know the notion of living in the present.
You'll eventually get somebody to talk to you about meditation.
Right, which
They've read about it or been exposed to it or tried it. Yeah.
correct,
Okay.
which is surprising.
In the quad, on a nice sunny spring day when it's full of students, you could find some people that probably do meditate.
Right,
Right.
and
But you're not going to find them in North Champaign, near
Correct.
the Douglas Library or on the basketball court in the poor section of North Champaign.
Rosa Lee having that, her ability to, or not ability, but she really lived in the present. We see today, and there's this notion of, like you should live in the present, and like for students, like, or like younger people, like you should live in the present, and so on and so forth.
Students aren't living in the present. They're achieving goals with taking 16 hours a semester with the goal of accumulating enough credits to graduate with a degree. That's not living in the present. You're fully vested in the future. And the foundation of that future will be your first degree, whether you go on to grad school or not.
Sure.
That's not living in the present. She was not able to invest in that kind of process of accumulating credits to achieve something big. She never lived like that. There's a scene in the book where she follows this boy that she was interested in to another teacher's class, and she realized that the children in this class were being taught, and they were getting an education, and where she was, the class that she was in, they were not being taught. And that's been the story of her life. She was not taught to read. There was nothing learning disabled about her. Let's look at Rosalie and Eric, her fifth son. Richard was her fourth son. Eric, there's nothing learning disabled about Eric Wright. He was never taught to read. There was nothing wrong learning disabled about Rosalie. She was never taught to lead. So there was no investment in... She lives in the present because that's the only place she can live. That's the importance is whether or not I have food on the table for my children. She kept all her children together. That was an extraordinary achievement, for one thing, except for one long stint in prison for stealing a fur coat out of Montgomery. I laughed because she walked right, she put the coat on, and I just see this scene where she's just walking out the store like the coat is hers. That's living in the present, you know. And the store detectives had been watching her, so they arrested her right outside the store. And she fussed at them, said, "This is my coat." They said, "Yeah, right," because she had taken the labels off and everything. So I'm just laughing at that scene. So she did 6 months in a Maryland prison, and her children went to live with her mother. But otherwise, she kept her children near her and kept them organized. So if she wakes up in the morning and there's no money in the house because the welfare check has been spent on whatever, the welfare check is a stipend. It's not some huge amount of money. So she's got 8 children, so she's fed them, clothed them, because she was very proud of keeping them prim and proper. And if shoplifting required her to do that, then she would shoplift. So she'd wake up in the morning and say, well, what am I going to do today? We spent up all the welfare check. The check won't come to the 1st of next month, and it's 2 weeks away. I don't have any money. My children have to eat. I'm going to go downtown and shoplift. That was her life. It was, you know. And she'd been doing that. She'd been shoplifting since she was 11. She got caught when she was pregnant with her second son, Ronnie, and did 9 days in a juvenile facility and went back to shoplifting the day after she left the juvenile prison. So that's really living in the present. What the students are doing, they're not living in the present, not from my point of view. They're headed for a goal. She had no goal except to live for the day. That's the only goal she had. Live for the day, do the best I can today to feed my children and feed myself. With children, I mean, students here are investing in their future. That's not living for the day. You may disagree, but I don't see it that way.
What did this teach you, just looking at the human psyche of how these families work and how Rosalie's mind worked? What did that teach you about just...
One of the greatest examples of what... I'm still in touch with one of her granddaughters who was... When I met her, these are people whose names I never mentioned. I never mentioned the name of Rosalie's youngest daughter because she dropped out of the project. And this is the youngest daughter's youngest child. So I'm always in touch with her on Instagram and Facebook. One Sunday, Rosalie took this granddaughter and with her to be baptized in a holiness church, what they call holiness, very fundamental church, where they see the Bible and the world in black and white. There's no gray. You're either evil or you're good, right? And she got baptized, and she had a granddaughter baptized. So the very next Sunday, they're going back to that same church. When Rosalie wakes up, it's cold, and she says, "Well, you can't go to the church with me in that dirty winter coat," because the winter coat that the child had was dirty. She said, "We're going to go to the secondhand store, and Grandma's going to get you a coat." Well, she taught the granddaughter how to shoplift a coat. She shoplifted a very nice, I saw the coat, very nice, pink. It wasn't going to be pink for long, but it was pink at that point. It was very pretty pink winter coat. And I couldn't put that together. That was very complicated for me. It's very simple for Rosalie, But it was very complicated for me. And there's a scene in there when I'm asking her, how do you do that? How do you take your granddaughter to be baptized in a Christian church one Sunday, and the very next Sunday, you take her shoplifting? I can't understand that. And Rosalie was looking at me, what's wrong with you? She looked at me like, I'd been hanging around with her now for about a couple of years. Where have you been? This is my lifestyle. So we went back and forth. We were having breakfast. It was a Sunday morning. It was a weekday morning at one of her favorite African-American soul food restaurants, French's on 8th Street Northeast in Washington. And I'm saying, well, I don't understand it. How you do that, how you work that through in your mind. Because you're under some level of morality if you're being baptized in a church, and then the very next Sunday you violate that morality. So that's what's complicated to me. It wasn't complicated to Rosalie. She just looked at me and she said, well, her winter coat was dirty and she needed a decent winter coat. I said, yeah, but how do you go and teach her to shoplift? Yeah, so she said, well, how else are we going to get the coat? I don't have the money for the coat. So then what about not going to church at all? She said, no, we were going to go to church. She was going to go to church in a new winter coat. And she said, and besides, that man, this is secondhand clothes and he charges too much. I said, that's got nothing to do with it. That's just a rationale. You can't use that. If he charges too much for secondhand clothes, then you don't buy them. You don't go there and shoplift. So later that day, or the next day, I don't remember which, I got a voice message from Rosalie on my office cell phone. I guess we had voicemail, not cell phones in those days, but my office phone. It was a message that she left for me. She said, I've been thinking about what you asked me about taking my granddaughter shoplifting, and you're right. It was wrong. But I didn't say to her it was wrong. I just asked her how did she work that through her mind. And she said, I won't do it again, and we're going to take the coat back. So I later checked, they didn't take the coat back. But she at least felt some sense of...
So this question...
Yeah, because I kept questioning her about it, and I was, by this time we've had a 2-year relationship, so we're friends, really. And she couldn't figure out why I was so perplexed by it. She woke up, she looked at Yolanda's coat, she said, oh, no, you're not going to church with me in that dirty winter coat. We're going to go get one, though. Just that simple. That's living by the day, yeah. She hadn't planned to take her granddaughter shoplifting. But when she saw the condition of her winter coat, she said, oh, no. You're not embarrassing me. We're showing up in church in a dirty coat. No, that's not happening. So we're going to go get a coat by hook or crook.
When you refer to these incidents, I'm curious, why do you refer to them as scenes, not as a part of?
Well, journalists write in scenes and think in scenes. Like you often see the way a story starts out. It's intriguing. The first paragraph is intriguing, but the message that is coming through in the story is further down. So that's called setting the scene. Journalists often do that. You learn to do that, set the scene, to pull the reader into the story. Right? You might start with anything intriguing or ironic to get the reader into the story before you really lay out what the story is going to tell the person or inform the person about. So I think in scenes. I try to get my students to think in scenes. They're not there yet because they're very young and inexperienced. But some of the scenes don't make any sense at all. I said, how is this tied to the story? I gave them a hard time. I said, this is a great scene, but it has nothing to do with the story. The story, it has to be connected. Yeah. So I think in scenes, and I may often use the phrase. I wasn't aware of it until you just brought it up. But I may often use the phrase. I think in scenes. Yeah. I think, how am I going to present this particular aspect of the story? Right. When I'm writing and laying out a series. And I said, oh, that conflict between me and Rosalie over her granddaughter's stolen winter coat, that may intrigue the reader. I don't know if I started a piece with that, but I know that's inside one of the pieces about her stealing and shoplifting, which she had been doing since the age of 11. Why did she start shoplifting and stealing clothes? Because her mother could only afford to take her to Goodwill or Salvation Army, and they were not fashionable clothes. And she wanted to feel good. So what did she do? She started going into retail outlets and shoplifting, and she got very good at it. She told me when I met her when she was 51 that she had stopped because she had gotten so slow. Not because she saw some moral imperative, but she had gotten too slow and was being caught too often. So it was time to start out, you know.
Like it was just black, or it was very clear in her mind. It was just black and white.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I need when she was 11, there's something about a skirt with 2 pockets on the side. It was very fashionable, and none of that was being sold as Salvation and Goodwill. So she went reluctantly with her mother. That's what her mother could afford. Her mother was working as a domestic. So she went very reluctant with her mother, but she always got away from her mother on another day or something else and went shoplifting and would roll the clothes up and stick them in a pocketbook or something, or wear loose-fitting clothes so that she'd put the skirt on or under the loose-fitting clothes and cover it up and walk right out the store with it. Yeah, and show up at school the next day fashionable. That was important to her, living for the day.
What's your writing process from very specifics?
I write down, after I do the interviews, I write dense notes, including quotes. Then I put the interviews away. I don't try to work from because the interviews are too long, and I work from the notes. I already have a concept of what anecdote I'm going to use to start this person's story. And then I work from the notes. And in the notes are entire quotes that I want to use. And inevitably, I have more notes than I'll ever do in writing a story, because none of the stories go on forever. And you have to stop at a certain point, or you lose the reader. It becomes a mass of gray, and the reader doesn't want to tackle it. Yeah. That's still true whether it's on the internet or in hard copy. Yeah.
Is there someone's style that you admire in this journalism?
Well, I've admired many people's styles writing. I've had a lot of heroes along the way that I've admired, men and women. I can't think of any right now. One is a guy named Steve. Well, they're not people that you would know. They're not well known. One is a guy named Steve Luxembourg, who was my editor for 11 years on the investigative desk. And we would plot things together. Because Bob Woodward was the supervising editor, and we would ignore what he wanted us to do and go off and do what I wanted to do. And Steve would collude with me, yeah. And then a year later, when Woodward was publishing one of his books, he said, "Wait a minute, what are you working on?" I said, "I'm working on this." I said, "Well, I told you I didn't want you to do that." I said, "I know you did." We did it anyway. It was about to be published. Yeah, so those were fun years. Fun years. So I was an investigator. When I came back from Africa, I was on the investigative desk for 14 years. It was great, really great. I don't have anything, after I sued the Washington Post for racial discrimination, I don't have any complaints.
Right. Are there any investigative journalists that you follow today, whose work you follow today?
No, most of them, my peers, I'm 78, most of my peers have retired or died. I'm surprised that I'm still going. At 78, I'll be 79 in March, So I'm grateful, but also surprised, I just got a message, today is Thursday? I got a message Monday from a childhood friend who told me one of our friends died an hour before he texted me the messages, And my response was, that's happening more often now. We've entered that age group. We're all around the same age, myself and my buddies. Only 3 of us are left of the crowd that I grew up with in the North Bronx. And it was a group of about 20 kids. Only 3 of us are left.
You said once that you never want to retire, that you want to they would have to pull you out of
No,
your
no,
grade
no,
home.
I didn't say that. I told my younger daughter,
Right.
who was always harassing me.
Yeah.
She graduated from here in 2005. She's a young woman with cerebral palsy, disabilities. So she went here through the dress program in theater studies. And it really made her very independent, but fortunately. But she kept harassing me, and I told her, you have to realize I'm a big tease with my children, both my daughters and my grandchildren, my grandsons. So I told my younger daughter, I said, look, you need to stop asking me about when I'm going to retire, because that's harassment. And there are federal laws against harassing the elderly. She just laughed. My daughters know me very well. They're not threatened by anything I say. And she just said, yeah, right. So I said, well, look, so that you stop asking me, I'll give you a date. And she said, well, what's the date? I said, the day after they carry me out of Gregory Hall, I'll retire. She said, what kind of date is that? I said, that's the date. Now you have your date. Whenever that happens, I'll retire. And so she sort of has left me alone since then. That was several years ago.
If you had to describe your life in one word, how would you describe
It's been a
it?
typical life with ups and downs, great achievements, setbacks. You don't let the setbacks keep you from going ahead and achieving. You accept it as a setback and keep moving forward. Yeah. So the life, I would say it was a normal life of achievement, setbacks, and growth on my part. And I've been married twice, divorced twice, 2 daughters, 3 grandsons, 1 great-grandson. It's not an exceptional life, but it's been a great life for me. It's been very rewarding and very interesting, and at points challenging. Yeah, and always a challenge, but because I created the challenge, things that I wanted to achieve. Yeah, I wanted to be a foreign correspondent. That took a lot of extra work, and I achieved it. So I really don't have any complaints, and I don't want any. Yeah.
What do you learn about love or marriage? In the beginning of the conversation, we're talking about that, there's no such a thing as absolute truth.
Right.
What's the role of love in your life?
Well, I have loved, but I think in both of my marriages I was unyielding as part of my arrogance. And that didn't go well because I married 2 strong women who felt that there should be some give and take. And I didn't feel the same way. And I didn't see it until hindsight. Now I have a companion, and we've been together off and on. We met in West Africa. She was born in Chicago, grew up in Los Angeles, worked for USAID. She's retired now from that. Now she's a research scholar with global studies here at the university. With this 3rd relationship, which is going on 41 years, I've become much more flexible. Otherwise, I wouldn't have made it to 41 years, and much more give and take. Yeah.
Give and take and being more humble.
Well, yes. Humility is part of it. Yeah. I didn't think of it in terms of when you asked me earlier about why I see humility as a virtue.
Right.
That was not what I saw. Earlier in my life, I saw humility as a weakness.
As a weakness.
Yeah. Now I see it as a virtue, but that's years of transitioning into where I am today. Yeah.
If you could call yourself, the young Leon Dash back in the 50s
Oh,
or
yeah.
the 60s.
Many regrets, many things that I would do very differently, and it would have had better results. Everybody says that. We all have regrets. We live with those regrets. Some of them painful, some of them just annoying. But bad choices, selfish choices. Often, my bad choices were selfish choices when I examined them truthfully for myself.
Could you give us an example?
I already gave you an example, but I didn't go into great detail. When my father stopped me when I was leaving the house one day in August 1958, I was 14. It was very self-centered of me to think of him as expressing something that went on in his generation, and me dismissing it as being applicable to me. No policeman's going to treat me unfairly. Why would they do that? That doesn't make any sense. And it was out of my self-centeredness and ignorance, really, that I dismissed. I didn't tell him that, but I dismissed what he was telling me, what he was warning me about, the things that I would face in the streets of New York, and how to react. Luckily, I kept it in the back of my head, and I heard his voice, and when I was in those circumstances, being pulled over or stopped by a policeman, I reacted just as he instructed me to react. Yeah, so that took time for me to recognize that, no, the world is not, my father's world is not much different from mine, although we're years apart.
How can one learn humility without making the mistakes that you've...
I don't think you can. I don't think you recognize humility until you do things selfishly and you recognize that you've been selfish, or someone points it out to you. My ex-wives were very good at pointing out when they felt I was being selfish. And they were right. When I examined it, they were right. I was wrong.
There's an argument that some people made that sometimes arrogance, so a lot of people who would achieve certain things or work on important things, sometimes they seem to be arrogant or they are arrogant, because that seems to be part of their why they could believe that they could do such thing.
Well, you can believe you could do anything you want to. You can believe you can achieve anything you think of without being arrogant. I don't think it makes a contribution to your achieving what you're seeking to achieve. I think it might work against you, particularly if you come into conflict with other people because of your arrogance. People are personally opposed to you because of your arrogance. I think the arrogance for whatever you're trying to achieve can work against you. That's my feeling today. I don't find it as, I don't see it as making a contribution to what you want to do. Let's take this Congressman, George Santos, fabulous, who made up this biography about himself. And now the people who voted for him out in Long Island, in New York State, are disappointed that they voted this man into Congress, and everything on his resume is a lie, or virtually almost everything. Now that's arrogance, and he's isolated now today in the Congress. Kevin McCarthy, the Speaker of the House, is not forcing him out because he feels that's up to his constituents that voted him in and the Ethics Committee to make a decision. So that's Kevin McCarthy's position. But this man is isolated. Every time you see him, he's running. He's surrounded by a pack of reporters asking him about his lies, and he's walking fast to get away from them. You know, that's arrogance. It's made no contribution to what he has achieved, being elected to Congress in a blue district. You know what I mean by blue?
Right.
Democratic district.
Right.
He won election. His opponent would love to have a re-election to now have another go at it. Yeah. But so he's in, he looks like he's in, well, he may not be in because he voluntarily stepped down from the committees he was appointed to, committees that were not so important or high profile, but he stepped down from both of them because he can't get anything done. Reporters are hounding him and other people don't want to talk to him and move away from him, very skeptical about being involved with him. Yeah, that's arrogance. And it's nothing but detrimental to him. If he had been without arrogance and maybe run and presented an honest resume to his constituents, he would not be in the position he's in today, being elected and not being able to do anything, and scorned by everyone.
So short-term gain, and really now...
No, for the rest of his life.
For the rest of his life.
Right, and people are not sure George Santos is his real name, because he used another name earlier. Right, he used his mother's maiden name. I think they figured out that George Santos is his real name, but earlier when he was part of a Ponzi scheme, he was using his mother's maiden name. I forget what it is, Boulderbeer or something like that. This man made claims that his parents were Holocaust survivors. You know, I mean, who does something like that? Someone who is arrogant and thinks he can get away with it, obviously, or thought he could get away with it. Yeah. Then he said his parents were Holocaust survivors and his mother was killed in the 9/11 attack on the World Health Center. Then they come across the New York Times, found an obituary, she died in 2016. You know, it just goes on and on and on, you know. You know, how can you in good conscience make up so many lies about yourself? You're blinded by arrogance. It's not a virtue. It's not good for you.
Do you think Rosalie have any arrogance?
No.
No.
No. I found her to be very humble in her own way. And she always came back when she would tell me, when I would ask her about, and she knew I disapproved. I wouldn't say that to her because it's not my position to disapprove. I'm hanging out with a woman who is a member of the underclass. And part of the definition of Urban Institute's, well, let me give you the Urban Institute's definition of what constitutes an underclass family. One, it is female-headed. Two, most of the adults between 18 and 65 are unemployed. It's welfare dependent. That's three. I've forgotten four. And five, petty criminal activity is a major stipend, major addition to the welfare stipend. So female-headed, welfare dependent. Most of the adults between 18 and 65 are unemployed, and most of the people in the family have not graduated from high school. So that would be the fourth one. Then the fifth one is petty criminal activity is a major contribution to the welfare stipend. And Rosalie with her shoplifting. So within that context, her position was always, I did everything I needed to do to survive. I don't care what you say or what anyone says. I did everything I needed to do to survive. Keep my children fed, keep myself fed, and I achieved that. So I have no regrets. She was really shocked when her daughter got involved in the murder of her boyfriend. Set up her boyfriend, Steve, to be held up by what are called stick-up boys, and they killed him. They thought he had money. And they ended up shooting him. And she ended up, originally, Patty, charged with accessory to murder. But because she cooperated with the prosecutors and told them everything they wanted to know, they charged her with accessory to robbery. But then she went to a federal prison for women in Connecticut. And that extended her life because she was AIDS, HIV positive before she was arrested. And while she was in the federal prison, she regularly got medication that extended her life. Within a year or two after she was released from prison, she was dead because she didn't follow the regimen of the retroviral drugs that she was supposed to take.
In your opinion, which social issues should the youth today care about?
That's a good question. Social issues, rather than scientific issues.
Both. We can.
Well, scientific is climate change would be the major one.
Right.
Social issues is the inequity of the American society. If we're just talking about the United States, which is hugely inequitable. You've got 1% of the population that draws huge sums of money from the operation of the American economy from passive income, meaning investments here and there, land, manufacturing, businesses, pharmaceuticals, you name it. They've got money in all of these enterprises, and it just draws income to them. And their tax rate is inequitable also. You and I may pay 33% of our salary in taxes, and they pay 12%. And they are reaping in these huge amounts of money. I find that inequitable. And I think the young people of today should be working to change that. We were talking about education for the poor. When I say the poor, I'm talking about all ethnic groups. Black, white, Asian American, Native American, Latino. The education here should be on an equal footing for everyone. Get rid of teachers who are not doing the job, not teaching properly, and providing children, all children, with a decent public education. It's not being done now. It never has been done. The United States likes to tout its public education system, but it's really a public education system that has corners of good education, mainly in middle-class communities. Not in poor communities, not even in working-class communities. It's amazing to me, it's almost criminal, that you can turn out children that are not learning disabled who are illiterate. How does that happen? After 12 years in school. How do you get through 6 years of school unable to read? You know, so, and it's still happening every day. So, but people have invested in it, and if they're aware of it, they're not exercised by it. So what are you going to do about it? We're expecting you and Juan David to turn it all around.
We'll make a new series.
We'll write a new series about this.
So, I don't know if you see American society as inequitable. Everyone doesn't have the same access to what the middle class has or what the rich has. Yeah.
Right.
Working class and the poor do not. And they don't see it within reach. So they make short, often disastrous choices. Short decisions lead to disaster. Criminal activity, dealing drugs, trying to make extra money, or trying to make a lot of money, and end up shot, killed by other drug dealers, shot, killed by the police, or arrested and sentenced to years in prison. Every young man that enters the drug trade with a gun, because he doesn't want his guns or his money taken from him by other drug dealers or what are called stick-up boys. So if you enter the drug trade, realistically, you have to be willing to kill, because you can't have a gun and not use it. If the stick-up boys know that you have a gun but you won't shoot them, then they will constantly confront you and take your money and your drugs and shoot you, because most often you are held up and robbed by the people who know you. So if that's your only avenue of achievement, dealing drugs in this very dangerous milieu or atmosphere, this circumstance, then you have no real choices, because it's a very short life. It may be lucrative for a couple of years, but it's a very short life. Rosalie's grandson, he's in the book, Rico. He began dealing drugs at 15. He and a friend attack another drug dealer who was invading their turf. They attacked the drug dealer with a .38 caliber revolver with 6 bullets. He had a Glock, or the equivalent of a Glock, with an extended clip of 20. They didn't know it. I can't imagine. They didn't hit him. They emptied the gun, shooting at him. I shouldn't be laughing. And they didn't hit him. And he chased them down and shot them both and killed them both. April, what year was that? 1986. Yeah.
The same year that Rosalie died.
Right. It was the same. Well, she died that July. Yeah,
Right.
but she was the day of his funeral, Rico's funeral, this is the day she entered the hospital, and she never came out. Yeah.
What advice would you give to a smart, motivated young person today about, living their life and having that sense of achievement?
Well, I would advise all young people to acquire a sense of humility. But I would only expect them to listen to me until they're much older. Age has a way of getting you to look at yourself and looking around, and the choices you've made and the mistakes you've made and the regrets you have for the choices you've made. So I still give the advice, so maybe my voice comes back to them when they begin to look at themselves or desire to change their approach to life. And I would say, if you have opportunities, and those opportunities, to get them, you have to take a risk, and take the risk. Particularly take the risk while you're young. Because if you fail, there's nothing wrong with failing. You just pick yourself up and try again, or try another path. So don't be afraid of failing. Again, if you fail, you just pick yourself up and go after something else, or the same thing again. Perhaps in failing, you learn something. If you follow the path and taken a risk and it didn't work for you, you have learned something then, and along the way you may not take the same path and still go after the same goal. Eventually you'll be successful. Yeah, don't be afraid of failure. Be willing to take risk.
And to end our show here, we have a segment called Underrated or Overrated, where we basically just give you a
This
prompt.
is like the NPR quiz shows on Saturday morning.
I have not seen those.
Yeah, the NPR is radio, National Public
Right,
Radio. Yeah, you wouldn't see this on radio.
Right. I haven't heard of those.
580 WILL. All right, but go ahead. 580 AM on your radio, but go ahead.
Where we basically just give you a prompt and you tell us whether you think it's underrated or overrated, in your opinion.
Okay.
So the first one, which I would like to ask, is the Pulitzer Prize. Do you think it's underrated or overrated?
Underrated. It takes a lot to get a Pulitzer Prize. It really does. I think I was nominated. I know I was nominated for When Children Want, the adolescent childbearing study, and a couple of other studies. The time I lived with the gorillas, the first time I lived with the gorillas in Angola, 73, and also the second time in 77. So that was 73, 77, 86. So that's 3 times I was nominated, and I won on the 4th nomination in 95, April 95. Yes, because the series ran in 94. Yeah, I was awarded the Pulitzer the following year. Now, it's made a big difference in my life. Coming here, I didn't come here as an assistant or an associate professor. I came here as a full professor. And winning the Pulitzer had a lot to do with that. Yeah. I hold a chair that allows me to travel and do research and attend conferences, swan the chair. The Pulitzer is part of that. At one point, I was the director of the Center for Advanced Study here. Pulitzer is a part of that, yeah. Those things wouldn't have been open to me, or I wouldn't be considered for them without the Pulitzer. So it's underrated.
The new ownership of the Washington Post. Overrated.
Jeff Bezos.
Underrated.
I was Jeff Bezos, as you told
Correct,
me,
yeah, that's the owner.
who bought the Post from his change drawer. $250 million. That's all he paid for it. My understanding is from some colleagues who still work there, that I still have contact with, that he's been hands-off as an owner, which I think is significant. Now he's getting more involved. He was there at the Post photograph in the newsroom. It was as recently as last week, and that's the first time he's been in the newsroom for years. And because they're getting ready to lay some staff off, and they laid off 20 people and dismantled the unit that they were in charge of. So he's the best kind of owner, from my point of view. He lets the journalists run the newspaper. And he's also been very helpful in getting the Washington Post connected with the internet and digital media, which the Post was failing to do, and that's why Donald Graham sold the Washington Post to Jeff Bezos, because he figured if anyone could save the Washington Post, because he had been trying for years, along with his older daughter. Was it one of Donald Graham's oldest daughter or older sister? I don't remember. But someone in his family was running the paper from the news angle, and they were not making any headway on digital media or getting digital subscriptions. That all turned around with Jeff Bezos. So I think he really saved the paper. And I myself, from an emotional tie, do not want to see the paper fold. It's still very aggressive paper, which I appreciate. So it still has the aggressive culture that I so much admired and was a part of for 32 years.
The March of Washington, which you attended.
63?
Yes, and not only that, but what it took to bring that many people together to bring about change. Underrated or overrated?
Underrated. People don't recognize the significance of that march and how what an impact it had on the people who attended. Yeah, they all focus on Martin Luther King's "I Have a Dream" speech, and the most emotional part of it. But it had a tremendous impact, and it was sources. I remember when I was then entering my sophomore year at Lincoln University, and when I returned to school after the march, that was all we talked about, the march and its impact on us. So there hasn't been a lot of, I don't know that there's been, I've seen a lot of documentaries. I like documentaries, and I look for them and I watch them. I haven't seen any documentary interviewing the people who attended that march and the impact it had on those individuals. I don't know that I would have filed a complaint against the Washington Post for racial discrimination if I had not attended that march. I see it as all connected as one continuum. So it had a profound impact on me, and I think it did on a lot of other people as well.
Right, that you came from, that level of inspiration that you saw, that definitely trickled down into each person's life, and that each person brought about change in the whole society.
Mm-hmm. And how do you achieve change? What do you have to do to achieve it? That came from my classes at Howard that dealt with those subjects.
What? You align the incentives of the public to bring about a change.
Yes.
I remember. I believe you met Martin Luther King at one point. You guys had a brief conversation. Is that right?
No, that's not right.
Okay,
I've never met him. I've seen him publicly,
right,
but I never had a conversation with him.
Those leaders, so MLK, Malcolm X, and everyone else that was part of that. Not only as to who they were, but as to their ability to bring that many people together into that vision. Overrated or underrated?
The impact that they had to get so many people to participate.
Right.
Their strengths as leaders or their charisma as leaders. Probably underrated. People like Martin Luther King, A. Philip Randolph, sleeping car porters, Malcolm X, had tremendous charisma at that time and could galvanize whole crowds of people. There's a scene in Spike Lee's movie about Malcolm X, and it's played by Denzel Washington. He plays Malcolm X. And I've seen this in Harlem. I saw this similar scenes. I attended street rallies that Malcolm X would speak at in Harlem on 125th Street and 7th Avenue. But his control over the militants of the Nation of Islam, who were called Fruits of Islam, telling them to go this way, go that way. And they all, in unison, did whatever he told them. And there's a scene in the movie, where he's in front of a police captain. They're in front of a precinct protesting something, and the police are threatening to take action if they don't get in front of the precinct. What they don't recognize is they're not talking to a street gang, and they don't move. They're not afraid of the police, and they sort of say it's almost like bring it. But they don't do that. They just stand there and just look straight at the policeman, and then the policemen do something that conforms with what they're asking. And then Malcolm X says, all right, turn right, and they all turn right. He said, let's move out. And a captain, a white police captain, looks at it and says, that's too much power for any one man to have. Well, so that scene captures the kind of power they had when they were at the height of their own popularity, right? So I've rarely seen that captured. And it's part of the story. In fact, when I was at Lincoln, Malcolm X came. I mean, all the students, about 700 students, came to they didn't come to a lot of events that the faculty all wanted us to come to, particularly church vespers on Sunday evening or something, some foolishness. But When Malcolm X came, the entire student body came to hear him talk. You know, so I don't think people recognized the power that they had, or the charisma, or the draw they had. And people wanted to participate, either with the militants in the Nation of Islam with Malcolm X, or with Southern Christian Leadership Conference headed by Martin Luther King. People or sleeping car porters, union folks, all wanted to participate in changing America and making it more equitable. And they saw these men as leaders.
The New York subway, underrated or overrated?
Overrated. It's become a dangerous place now, with slashes and people pushing people off platforms onto the tracks. It's dangerous. My lady friend was there recently, last August, and luckily she hooked up with, she was staying in Brooklyn, but she was involved in human rights work at the UN in Manhattan. And a childhood friend of mine, she met him and his girlfriend for dinner, and then she was going to take the subway back to Brooklyn late at night. And my friend said, no, we're not going to read about you in the front page of the newspaper tomorrow. So they took her, although it was relatively inconvenient for them. They said they didn't want anything to happen to her, and they took her to where she was staying in Brooklyn, which is right across the East River from Manhattan. When I was growing up in New York City, that was not a concern. I rode the subway any time of day or night, with no fear. I started riding the subway. I remember my parents would send me down to a dentist. We lived on 135th Street and 5th Avenue, and I would take the subway train down to 42nd Street in Times Square to go to the dentist. It was connected with my father's work at the New York City Post Office, this dental service. But there was no fear on his part that I go. Sometimes I hopped the turnstile so I could keep the 15 cents. 15 cents went along, you get a whole slice of pizza for 15 cents. You know what hop the turnstile is? You don't even know what that is.
I know, I've seen it.
Oh, okay. In Chicago?
No, in New York too.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
All right. Do you know?
I've heard of it.
You've heard of it, so you both know what it is, yeah. You have to wait till the train pulls into the station, then you make a run for the turnstile, left hand on the top, open the top, then run down the platform when the doors open into a car.
Yeah, right.
Be quick.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, those days have passed. I don't hop the turnstile anymore.
Just like Rosa Lee, you would get caught.
Yeah. I'm going to New York early March for a friend's mother's 100th birthday.
Oh, what?
And I will not be hopping any turnstiles. I'll pay the full fare. But now it's a couple of dollars to ride the train.
Yeah, it is.
So when I say 15 cents, you know how long ago that was. Yeah. Yeah.
Are you gonna ride the subway when you go?
No, I probably won't. I'll probably stay in Yonkers and then come down. The birthday celebration is at a senior citizens community center right across the street from where I grew up.
Oh.
So that'll be great. And it's on a Saturday, so there'll be some parking during the day. It's you can tell it's a party for a person who's 100 years old. The party is 3 o'clock to 7. And that's it, yeah. So I'm looking forward to that. I haven't been to New York in about a year. I like going back to New York. I have no desire to move back there to live. Yeah.
Yeah, I was there last year. Always something interesting with it. It's just a different essence.
It is, a different spirit.
Right.
Yeah. Particularly moving around Manhattan, day or night, yeah.
It's the essence of artists, entrepreneurs, finance people, actors. They're
A
all
lot of energy, yeah.
are all that ambition of making it not just making it one time, but making it really big, no matter what it is.
Everyone has that ambition.
Right.
Only a few achieve it. Yeah, it's like going to LA to make it in the movies. Yeah.
Right.
Same thing. Yeah.
Last one.
Okay.
So you spend your life doing journalism in the form of newspaper media, right? And a lot of the journalism that people watch today is more digital. It's
Right.
more maybe in the form of videos or maybe on their phones.
Or
So
Twitter or something.
exactly. So this new notion, let's say the media outlets, let's say for example CNN, um, do you consider the like it's a different fact that we had to transition, like society as a whole transition to this medium, but in your opinion, do you think journalism, like the spirit of journalism, still stays intact with the format that we have today, or you think that it's overrated?
Oh, no. Conventional journalism is just as aggressive. I mean, you have to, as a reporter, you have to remain polite but aggressive. You're expected to be aggressive. Or your editors expect you to be aggressive. You don't turn away from a story. You go after it. And you remain professional and polite, and you see the people on CNN when they're going after interviews or when they're interviewing someone, most of them are asking tough questions. And you have to be tough in journalism industry, whether it's digital media, broadcast media, radio, or print. Doesn't matter. That's what I tell my students. I teach a course here, Advanced Public Affairs Reporting. And I tell the students that the course is difficult. In fact, the first day of class, the first time we meet, I go around the room and see how many hours each student is taking and see if they have the capacity to stay with the course, and because it's very demanding. And I tell them this course is demanding for a reason. When you come out of here, when you graduate from this course, particularly if you pass this course, you'll be able to go into any newsroom anywhere in the world, and whether it's digital media, print media, broadcast, or radio, and begin putting together your own beat. Because you're going to put together your own beat starting today. All right, and you will know how to do it, and I'll be with you all along the way. And don't complain. Oh, a lot of them read the syllabus. I've had students tell me they read the syllabus and cried. Literally. And I said, you have to be kidding. He said, no, I'm not. None of the boys admitted to crying, but some of the women did in the class. And she said, the one who admitted to me that she cried, or volunteered to me that she cried, I said, what were you crying about? She said, I didn't think I could do it. And I said, here's the end of the semester and you've done it. So now you know what you're capable of doing. And you're prepared to do it in any news medium at all. And that's my goal, that you can do anything, anywhere you want to. I said, when you're hired at a place, I said, you don't want to be sitting around at your desk waiting for some editor to assign you some old press conference or something stupid to cover, because he's bored or she's bored and they don't know what to do with you. You want to go out and start creating your own beat immediately and getting your own stories. You want to be a self-starter, because if you're not a self-starter in journalism, you're not going anywhere. You'll be assigned to weekend nights or do obituaries. So to avoid that, you need to be a self-starter. You need to go after your own stories. If you're not curious, then you shouldn't be in journalism, because you need an insatiable curiosity that keeps you going from one story to the next. Right, or even if you're on one beat, you just keep going after the next story. Right, and you see the next story, and you know how to get to it, and you go after it. Right, and as soon as that story is published, broadcast, put on digital media, whatever, you're on to the next story. And that's how you will be a success in this industry. So, as I tell all the students, I said, so you find this course demanding. All of you can pass it if you stay with it and you don't procrastinate. Because if you procrastinate, you will really create a lot of problems for yourself, particularly when we get to doing the major project at the end of the semester. So, they complain and they moan and they talk about me like a dog, and then they all smile at the end of the semester, particularly those who pass. I had one student who really surprised me. He failed, which is not unknown. Many number of students fail advanced public affairs reporting. He took it with me the very next semester, and he got an A. And that wiped out the failing grade. I didn't know you could do that. I was early in my time here. I didn't know you could do it. I was wondering why he was taking, because he had the opportunity to take it with other professors. Why was he taking it again with me? He already failed with me. And something about that semester that he failed, he wasn't getting it together, whatever was going on with him. But the next semester, he was on it. And he was really on it. Every paper he turned in got an A. So I was quite impressed with that. And now and then I come across his byline. And he's doing very, very good work. Very good work, yeah.
Are you aware with the current AI developments?
Well, vaguely, you mean artificial intelligence and about writing students' papers and so on?
No, like for you, like let's say you want to know something, you can just ask the AI and it will tell you, like, yeah, I could also write a paper or whatever.
Yeah.
Have you used it?
No, I haven't.
You might find it interesting.
I probably would, but right now I'm moving toward, I'm shooting videos of the people that, I've been interviewing people across the United States of what their defining ethnic moment was, white and black, in the context of American society. What is your defining ethnic moment? What experience defined you as a white person or defined you as a black person? And with my colleague, Stretch Ledford, in the Department of Journalism, he and I have been going around doing video shoots of the people I've interviewed for a number of years now. And we've got 3 or 4 yet to do. One in New York, one in Philadelphia, one in Los Angeles, and one in upstate New York. And this summer, I plan to start, I'd like to get the video shoots done this spring semester, because this summer I'll begin writing the book on defining ethnic moments. And it will be also, I've decided it will be a part memoir. So the working title is Defining the Defining Moments in Black and White, a Journey. Because I will put a lot of myself and my experiences in the book as well. So artificial intelligence is down the road. If I live that long and have time to get to it, I will. But right now, I'd like to get the video. Stretch convinced me to buy a domain, so we bought a domain for the videos. And my interest is to get the videos done. He will be editing the videos, and I will go to the writing. That's my focus at the moment. Yeah.
Will that be your final book? Or
I don't know if I live long enough.
do you have more books planned?
More projects.
Well, what I was thinking that I might do additions to that book and add them to the book as time goes on. Okay. Like I did with Rosa,
right,
and with Children Want Children. I've added things to the book when they were republished. Yeah.
Journalism used to be usually in print or perhaps in interviews, but now it's become more digital and more social media and faster pace.
Well, I consider most social media journalism. I'm on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. I don't consider that journalism.
Right, but that's
I may
where
post a journalistic article on all 3, but the function of commenting and so on, I don't consider journalism. Go ahead.
most people consume news media
That way.
from these social media outlets.
Right. I think that's unfortunate.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah. When I first was new here, the students took advantage of me. This is back in '98 when I started teaching. And every time there was an assignment due, the grandmothers died. And I said, where are all these grandmothers? Why are all these grandmothers dying when the paper is due? And I said, fine. I said, all right, everybody gets 2 grandmothers. And they accused me of being without compassion. So I inserted a paragraph in my syllabus, and all of my syllabi now. This is when I was first teaching advanced public affairs reporting, and I tell you the course is demanding, so the students were slacking off, and they couldn't get the work done in time. And so I said, look, if death is part of the cycle of life, and if you have someone in your family that you're close to who dies, and you have to attend the funeral, you will be excused, and you can hand in the assignment that's due late with no penalty. But I need to see the funeral program. And if you're not on the funeral program, then I need someone in your family to call to establish your relationship with the deceased. Grandmother stopped dying. So I was very proud of myself. I provided longevity for the grandmothers of Illinois.
It's a great deed.
Yes.
That you've done.
It was wild, yeah. Students knew I was new. It was my first semester teaching. So they were just working me over.
But thank you so much for coming and talking to us and teaching us everything from the journey.
It's been interesting.
Yes, thank you so much.
And I see you did a little research on me. I was surprised, yeah.
I mean, that's how.
That should be the expected, like the minimum thing you can
It
do.
is really, because I don't go to interview anyone without knowing something about them, yeah. Absolutely, yeah.
You can't really ask good questions without.
You can't.
Yeah.
A lot of journalists, well, you know a journalist is not a real, you know when a reporter is not really doing what he or she is doing when they don't know enough about the person to ask a number of questions and get into the details, yeah.
Right.
Because asking the questions produces more questions for the journalist,
Exactly.
yeah. And if you have no questions, you've done no research. Yeah, well, I've been in those, particularly on book tours, I've been in a situation where I've been in front of a journalist and they were going to interview me about the book. They knew nothing about the book, nothing about me. And it's kind of funny because then I have to carry the interview.
And you need to ask your question yourself.
I need to present information as if I've been asked the question.
Right.
Yeah.
Did you know there was a scene in the book?
Oh yeah. Or bring up an anecdote. I said, well, this will illustrate what we're talking about here.
Right.
Blah, blah, yeah. Okay, gentlemen.
And thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed this conversation where we covered all range of topics and went back in time and looked at what living in some of the poorest communities looked like back in 60s, 70s, and the kind of experiences just Professor Dash has had over the years. One of the most interesting part of this conversation, in my opinion, was about humility and how you can only develop that the more experiences that you have. It's not something you can develop overnight, but it's something that everyone should strive to inculcate in them. And as he has been very frank with us about it, that he started as someone arrogant, but over time his experiences and meeting and talking with a lot of people just made him the person who he is today. And I'm very grateful for all the stories that he has shared with people like us who can relate to it and learn from them. Where we might find faults in people and maybe look down upon a poor community, he found a friend. He found someone who was perfectly logical in their own way. And I think that's something that we all need to understand, which is people have their reasons for doing things, and we might not have all the context before we judge them. So it's always important to have the patience and just the humility and the time to understand them and just see how similar we are. And I think that's a great trait which I admire about you, and I thank you for all the work that you've done.
Thank you.
As you mentioned, curiosity drives a lot of the things that we do today. A lot of journalism is driven by curiosity and that drive to know the truth. And that's true for any field that you take today. If you're not curious, you might not reach where you want to be. And I think curiosity lies at the foundations of all the things that we do today. So as we have said always, and I say it again today, stay curious, and we'll see you next time. Thank you.